This happened when I was about 10 years old, the kind of memory that sticks with you long after you've grown up, the kind you can still feel in your bones when you think about it. My family lived out in the country, miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by thick woods and a dirt road that turned to mud whenever it rained. It was a place where the nights were so dark that you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, and the silence could swallow up all sound, leaving you feeling like the only person left in the world. My little brother, Kevin, and I used to play outside all the time, exploring the woods behind our house until the sun dipped below the treetops. On this particular evening, we had stayed out a little longer than usual, playing catch near the edge of the forest. It was getting dark, the sky turning that deep shade of blue that means you're running out of time before night takes over completely. I remember hearing the crickets start up their song, and the air was starting to cool as I tossed the ball back to Kevin. That's when we heard it, the scream. It cut through the evening air like a knife, this blood-curdling sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the woods. For a second, I thought it was a woman, someone in trouble, because it was so raw and desperate. Kevin froze, the ball slipping from his hand, his eyes wide with fear. And even though I was trying to be the brave older brother, my legs felt like jelly. But then, just as quickly as the scream had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was even worse, thick and heavy, pressing down on us. Kevin grabbed my arm, his voice shaking as he asked, "What was that?" I tried to play it off, saying it was probably just an animal, but I didn't believe it myself. I had grown up in those woods, knew the sounds they made, and nothing I had ever heard before had sounded like that. We stood there for a few more moments, straining to hear anything else, but all we got back was the rustle of leaves in the wind. I turned to Kevin and said, "Let's go back to the house. It's getting late anyway." He nodded, but he kept glancing over his shoulder as we started up the hill, his hand gripping mine tight enough to hurt. About halfway back, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Branches snapping, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush. It was coming from behind us, from the direction of the scream. I didn't even think. I just grabbed Kevin's arm and started running. We scrambled up the hill, our feet slipping on the loose dirt, my lungs burning as I tried to keep hold of my brother's hand. Behind us, the footsteps grew louder, like whatever was following us was picking up speed. Kevin stumbled and almost fell, but I managed to pull him back up, my heart hammering in my chest. We tore through the trees, our breaths coming in panicked gasps, the darkness closing in around us. The only thing I could think about was reaching the house, reaching the safety of the front door. By the time we burst out of the woods into the clearing where our house stood, my legs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't stop. We ran up the porch steps, nearly tripping over each other in our panic, and I slammed the front door shut behind us, bolting it with trembling hands. My mom came out of the kitchen, asking what the hell was going on, but I could barely get the words out. "We heard something," I gasped. "Something's in the woods." She frowned, looking from me to Kevin. But before she could say anything else, there was a noise, a low, guttural growl that rumbled through the night air, coming from somewhere just beyond the porch. My mom's face went pale, and she hurried to turn off the lights, motioning for us to stay quiet. We crouched there in the dark, listening to the sounds outside. There was a shuffling, something dragging itself along the edge of the porch, a shadow moving just beyond the windows. I pressed my back against the wall, holding Kevin's hand so tightly that he winced, but he didn't let go. My mom grabbed the old shotgun she kept for emergencies, her hand steady even though I could see the fear in her eyes. For what felt like hours, we waited in the darkness, listening to the thing move around the house, brushing against the walls. At one point, it sounded like it was right outside the front door, its breathing heavy and labored, and I had to bite down on my own hand to keep from making a sound. I remember thinking that whatever it was too close, too human-sounding to be any kind of animal. And then, just like that, it was gone. The shuffling faded into the distance, swallowed up by the forest, leaving nothing but silence behind. We stayed huddled there for a long time, not daring to move or speak until we were sure it wasn't coming back. My mom finally got up, slowly unlocking the door and peering outside, but there was nothing, no sign of whatever had been out there. The next morning, she called the local sheriff, but he just shrugged it off, saying it was probably a bear or a coyote. But we knew better. We knew what a bear sounded like, and it sure as hell wasn't that. My mom never told us what she thought it was, but after that night, she made sure we never stayed out late again. She even put up new locks on all the doors and windows, and for a while, she slept with a shotgun by her bed. A few weeks later, we heard from one of our neighbors that they'd found some strange tracks down by the creek, a mix of bare human footprints and something else, like claws digging into the mud. They said it looked like someone had been dragging themselves through the dirt, and that whatever it was had left deep gouges in the tree trunks nearby. The sheriff dismissed it, but the old-timers in town whispered about skinwalkers, creatures that could change their shape and mimic the voices of those they lured into the woods. I don't know if I believe all that, but I do know that something followed us home that night, something that wasn't quite right. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right through the trees, I think I can still hear that scream, echoing through the woods, carrying a memory of something dark and wild. Even now, years later, I refuse to go back into those woods. Not at dusk, not in the daylight. Whenever I visit my mom, I make sure to stay well away from the tree line, keeping my eyes on the shadows just beyond the yard. Kevin tries to laugh it off, but I can tell it still scares him too. He never forgot how that night felt, how close that thing came to the house, how we could feel its breath on the other side of the door. And deep down, I know we were lucky. Lucky that we ran when we did. Lucky that we made it back home. Because whatever it was, I'm pretty sure it wasn't going to let us leave the woods a second time. So, a little story about what worked for me as someone who's always been pretty shy. I used to be the kind of guy who'd overthink every possible scenario before approaching a woman. Like, what if she thinks I'm weird? Or what if I say the wrong thing and she rolls her eyes? It was a mental spiral that usually ended with me deciding not to approach at all. But then I figured out a simple way to keep myself from being that awkward guy, and it actually worked. A few months ago, I was at this local farmer's market. It's the kind of place that's super relaxed, with little booths selling handmade candles, fresh fruit, and funky vintage clothes. I spotted this woman browsing the vinyl records section, flipping through albums with this intense concentration, like she was searching for something specific. She looked cool, and I could feel that old nervousness creeping in, like I wanted to say something but had no idea how to start. Instead of letting my mind run away with a million different approaches, I just took a breath and thought, okay, what would I say if this was a guy standing there? So I walked over, glanced at the records, and casually said, "Got any good finds yet?" She looked up, a little surprised, but she smiled. "Not yet, but I'm hoping to find some Bowie in here." I'm not even a big David Bowie fan, but I knew enough to keep the conversation going. We ended up chatting for a bit about our favorite albums, and then I told her about this record shop I knew nearby that had a pretty solid classic rock section. I made a point not to linger too long, just enough to have a nice exchange, and then said, "Hey, if you're ever interested in checking out that place, I'd love to show you around sometime." No pressure, though. She paused for a second, and honestly, my heart was racing because I had no idea what she'd say. But then she smiled again and said, "That sounds fun, actually. Why don't you give me your number?" She put it in her phone, and we've been out a couple of times since then. I think what made it work was that I didn't treat it like a high-stakes thing. It wasn't about whether or not she'd be into me. It was more like, "Hey, I'm curious about what you're interested in, and I'm happy to walk away if you're not feeling it." It took the pressure off both of us, and I think she could sense that I wasn't just trying to pick her up. I was genuinely curious about what she liked, and it showed. The biggest lesson for me? Just being friendly and treating the person you're talking to like a normal human being works wonders. Don't overthink it. Don't try to come up with some grand opening line. Just talk like you're at a neighborhood barbecue where everyone's just having a chill conversation. It's amazing how much easier things get when you drop the expectations and just let things flow naturally. This is a story I don't think I'll ever forget. It's the most terrifying experience I've had. I was visiting a friend who lived out in a pretty rural area, the kind of place where the nearest neighbor is a good mile away and the night is pitch black without streetlights. We planned a quiet weekend, catching up and doing some fishing at the lake near his place. On the second night, after a long day out on the water, we stayed up late, sitting out on the porch, talking over beers. Around midnight, we both turned in for the night. My friend's place was small, and he set me up in the spare bedroom at the back of the house. It faced out into the woods, just a wide stretch of dense trees that went on for miles. I'd only just started to doze off when I woke up to the sound of a creak outside the window. It sounded like footsteps on the wooden porch. At first, I figured maybe it was just my friend getting up for some water or something, but then I remembered that his bedroom was on the other side of the house. The thought made my skin crawl. I lay there, holding my breath, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it. But then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate creak, like someone trying to move quietly across the porch. I felt my heart hammering in my chest as I sat up and peered out the window, but all I could see was darkness. I thought about waking my friend, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. So I just sat there in the dark, straining my ears for any sound. A few minutes later, there was a louder noise, a thud, like someone dropping something heavy against the side of the house. My mind started racing with all the worst possibilities. Was it an animal? Or was it someone trying to break in? I reached for my phone, but then I realized we didn't have any cell service out there. I felt completely cut off from the outside world. Just me and the darkness pressing in from all sides. That's when I heard a voice, a low, rasping whisper, but I couldn't make out the words. It sounded like it was right outside the window, but the tone was all wrong, slow and deliberate, like someone was speaking through gritted teeth. My blood went cold. I couldn't move. I just sat there, staring out into the blackness, praying that it was all in my head. But then, to my horror, the whispering stopped, and there was a scratching sound against the window, like someone running their nails along the glass. My mind went blank with terror, and I finally bolted out of bed, running straight for my friend's room. I shook him awake, stammering about someone outside. He grabbed his flashlight and a baseball bat from the closet, muttering that it was probably just some animal, but he followed me back to the spare room. He shone the light out the window, and for a moment, we didn't see anything. But then, just at the edge of the beam, we caught a glimpse of movement, something slipping back into the trees. I only saw it for a second, but I swear it looked like a hunched figure, just beyond the tree line, melting into the shadows. My friend bolted the door, and we stayed up the rest of the night, keeping watch. Neither of us said much, but I could see the tension on his face. We didn't hear anything else, but every little creak and rustle outside set my nerves on edge. It felt like time had stopped, like the night would never end. At dawn, we finally stepped outside to look around, and that's when we saw it, scuffed footprints in the dirt near the window, leading out toward the woods. They definitely weren't from an animal. We never figured out who or what it was or why they were there. My friend said it was probably some weirdo passing through, but I could tell the whole thing shook him up too. He ended up calling the local sheriff, but there wasn't much they could do without any real evidence. I left later that day, driving away with my heart still pounding in my chest. Even now, I can't shake the image of those footprints outside the window or the sound of that voice, so low and close, like someone trying to share a secret that I didn't want to hear. It was a reminder of how quickly a peaceful night can turn into something out of a nightmare, especially when you're far from the safety of the city. It's been years, but every time I find myself in a quiet, dark place, I remember that night and how small and helpless I felt, listening to the whispers in the dark. All right, here's my secret. I've been taking pottery classes on the slide just so I can make her a mug. Sounds pretty random, right? But trust me, there's a story behind it. My partner is a total coffee addict. She has this little morning ritual where she'll brew her perfect cup, sit by the window, and just soak up the quiet before the chaos of the day begins. She has a whole collection of mugs, each one with its own backstory. There's one from a tiny cafe we found on a road trip, another she picked up at a flea market, and even a handmade one that her best friend made in college. But she has this one favorite, a chunky, misshapen, bright yellow mug with a little heart carved into the side. It's not the prettiest thing, but she's had it forever. She's super careful with it, always washing it by hand and putting it back in its special spot on the shelf. One day, a few months ago, I was unloading the dishwasher and bumped the edge of the counter. I heard a crack, and there was her favorite mug in two pieces on the floor. I felt my heart sink. She took it better than I expected. She just sighed, picked up the pieces, and said, well, it had a good run. But I could tell she was really bummed about it. She tried to glue it back together, but it never quite looked the same, and she ended up putting it in the back of the cabinet where it just gathered dust. It felt like I'd broken a little piece of her morning joy, and I couldn't stop thinking about how I could make it right. That's when I got the idea. I started looking up local pottery classes and found this little studio a few towns over. It's one of those places where they teach you the basics, and you get to make your own stuff. Even use the wheel if you're brave enough. I signed up for their beginner's course and told her I was working late on Thursdays. She just rolled her eyes and joked about how my boss must love my dedication. I felt a little bad for the lie, but I knew it'd be worth it. Let me tell you, pottery is a lot harder than it looks. I spent the first few classes just trying to get the clay to stay centered on the wheel. My first few attempts at a mug came out looking more like lopsided ashtrays than anything you'd want to drink coffee from. But every time I messed up, I'd picture the way her face might light up if I actually managed to pull this off, and it kept me going. Slowly but surely, I started getting the hang of it. I made a few wonky bowls and a vase that kind of looked like a squash soda can, but finally, I managed to shape something that actually looked like a mug. I even learned how to put a little heart on the side, just like the one she used to have. The glazing part was a disaster. I ended up with way too many bubbles and spots where the color didn't stick right, but I tried again and again until I got it to this warm, golden yellow that reminded me of sunshine. I've been sneaking my creations home in a cardboard box, stashing them in the garage where she won't find them. I've even got a few backups, just in case the final version doesn't turn out as well as I hope. But I'm getting better, and now I think I've got a mug that might just measure up. It's not perfect. There's a little wobble to it, and the heart is slightly crooked, but it's made with a whole lot of effort and a little bit of love. The plan is to give it to her on her birthday, along with a bag of her favorite coffee beans. I've even been practicing this little speech in my head about how I wanted to replace what I broke, and how I hope she'll make new memories with this one. I'm nervous as hell, but I keep imagining her unwrapping the box, seeing the mug, and realizing that I made it myself. I hope she'll get that it's not just about the mug. It's about wanting to give her back that piece of her morning that I accidentally took away. I've nearly let the secret slip a few times. There was this one evening when she found a bit of dry clay under my fingernails and asked if I'd been gardening. I panicked and said something about fixing a flower pot outside. She just raised an eyebrow and shrugged it off, but I think she suspects I'm up to something. And then there's the constant temptation to show her my progress. Sometimes I'll be washing my hands after a class, and I'll catch myself wondering if she'd laugh at my lopsided attempts or if she'd try to give me pointers like she does when I'm struggling with a new recipe. But I keep reminding myself that the surprise will be worth it, that seeing her face when she realizes how much effort I've put in will make all the sneaking around worthwhile. So yeah, that's my big secret. I've been turning myself into a part-time potter, all because I want to give her back that silly yellow mug in my own clumsy way. I know it's just a small thing, but I hope she sees that it's more than just clay and glaze. It's a piece of me trying to give her something special, something that'll make her mornings a little brighter again. This happened a few years ago, but the memory is still crystal clear. I was living in this old apartment building downtown, the kind where you can hear your neighbor's footsteps through the walls and the pipes clank when it gets too cold. It was a small place, but it was mine, and I'd gotten used to the quirks, like the creaky floorboards and the way the front door sometimes stuck when it was humid. One night, I got home late from work, totally wiped out from a long shift. I remember dragging myself up the stairs, fumbling with my keys, and finally collapsing onto the couch without even bothering to change out of my work clothes. I fell asleep almost immediately, too tired to do anything else. I must have slept for a couple of hours when I woke up to this weird sound. It was soft like a scraping noise, and I couldn't quite place it. I figured it was probably one of the neighbors, so I ignored it and tried to go back to sleep. But the noise kept going, this steady scraping that got louder and more insistent. It sounded like it was coming from my front door. At that point, I was wide awake, my heart starting to race. I sat up and tried to listen, straining to hear over the sound of my own breathing. There was a pause, and then I heard a quiet click like someone was trying to pick the lock. My stomach dropped, and I felt this surge of cold panic run through me. I grabbed my phone and crept over to the peephole, moving as quietly as I could. I held my breath as I peered through, expecting to see nothing but the empty hallway. Instead, there was a shadowy figure crouched right outside my door, their hands working on the lock. I froze, my mind racing through a dozen possibilities. What do they want? Are they armed? Should I call the police or just wait it out? I knew the old door wouldn't hold if they decided to kick it in, and I didn't have any real way to defend myself if they got inside. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 2 tries to dial 911. I whispered into the phone, trying to keep my voice steady, explaining that someone was trying to break into my apartment. The dispatcher stayed on the line, telling me to stay put and keep quiet. I felt completely helpless, pressed up against the wall by the door, clutching my phone like it was a lifeline. I kept glancing through the peephole, and that's when I saw the figure lean closer to the door, tilting their head like they were listening for any movement inside. I thought my heart would stop right then and there. I backed away from the door, moving as quietly as I could, and grabbed a heavy lamp from the side table. Probably a ridiculous weapon, but it was all I had. I just kept praying that the police would get there in time, that I wouldn't have to face whoever was on the other side of that door. Minutes felt like hours as I waited in the dark, trying not to make a sound. Finally, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, quick steps that were definitely not my unwanted visitor. There was a loud knock, and a voice called out, "Police!" The figure outside my door bolted immediately, the sound of their footsteps echoing down the hallway. I opened the door just a crack, enough to see 2 officers running down the hall, trying to chase the guy. They didn't catch him, but I found out later that they had patrol cars circling the area for the rest of the night. The officers asked me questions, took down my information, and checked the lock on my door, which had definitely been tampered with. They told me it looked like a classic attempted break-in, but they didn't have much to go on. After they left, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I just sat there on the couch with my back to the wall, jumping at every little noise. For weeks, I was scared to come home, scared to leave the apartment, scared of every shadow I saw in the hallway. I ended up moving out a few months later, not because of the building's quirks, but because I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched, of knowing that someone had tried to invade my space, my sense of safety. Even now, whenever I hear a strange noise at night, I get that same knot in my stomach, like I'm right back in that apartment, clutching a lamp and hoping the door will hold. It's a kind of fear that never really leaves you, even when the danger is long gone. When I was a kid, my family used to take trips to a cabin we had up in the mountains. It was one of those old places my grandfather built back in the 60s. No frills, no electricity, just a wood stove and an old propane heater to keep things warm. We'd go up every winter, escaping the bustle of the city for a few days of snow-covered peace. I always loved those trips, the crackle of the fire, the way the snow piled up on the roof, and how quiet everything got when the sun went down. But there's one trip I'll never forget, and it's not because of the fun we had. It's because I learned just how dangerous that quiet could be. It was a particularly cold December, and my dad and I went up early to get the cabin ready for the rest of the family. The drive up the mountain road was treacherous, the snow coming down in thick, heavy flakes that turned the world into a white blur. But we made it, pulling up to the cabin just as the last light of day was fading. Inside, the air was like ice. My dad got to work setting up the propane heater, a big, clunky thing that looked like it belonged in a museum. He always insisted it worked fine, that there was no need to replace it as long as it got the job done. He checked the connections, twisted the valve, and then lit the pilot light, the familiar hiss and flicker filling the room. I watched him do it a dozen times over the years, never thinking much of it. We went about the rest of the evening getting things ready, unpacking groceries, stacking wood by the stove, and eventually settling in with a couple of mugs of hot cocoa. I remember thinking it felt like the perfect start to the trip. But then sometime around midnight, I woke up with a pounding headache. At first, I thought I was just dehydrated, so I stumbled into the kitchen area to get a glass of water. That's when I noticed it, this strange, sweet smell in the air, like rotting fruit. It was faint, but it didn't belong there. I wandered around, still half asleep, trying to figure out where it was coming from. As I got closer to the heater, the smell grew stronger, and I noticed my head was spinning, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. I shook my dad awake, telling him that something didn't smell right, but he just mumbled that I was imagining things. Still, I must have sounded worried enough because he got up and went over to the heater. He fiddled with the knobs, and I saw him frown, his brow furrowing like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Then he went pale, his eyes going wide in the dim light. He grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door with more strength than I thought he had. "We need to get out," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Now!" I didn't argue. We stumbled outside into the snow, the cold air biting through my pajamas, but I didn't care. My dad made me sit on the porch steps while he ran back inside, covering his mouth with his shirt, and yanked open all the windows. By the time he came back out, his face was flushed, and he was breathing hard, like he'd run a marathon. We sat there together, shivering in the darkness, watching our breath turn to steam in the freezing air. It turned out that the old heater had developed a leak, letting propane seep into the cabin all night while we slept. The sweet smell I'd noticed was the added scent they put in propane as a safety measure, but it's subtle, easy to miss, especially when you're asleep or half-conscious. My dad told me later that if we hadn't gone outside when we did, we might not have woken up at all. The next morning, we borrowed a neighbor's carbon monoxide detector and set it up inside just to see what it would say. It went off almost immediately, the piercing alarm cutting through the quiet morning air. The levels it showed on the screen were off the charts. We both stared at the little blinking numbers, trying to wrap our heads around how close we'd come to not walking out of that cabin alive. After that, my dad finally agreed to get rid of the old heater, replacing it with something modern, something with built-in safety features. But the memory of that night never left me. Every time I think about it, I remember the way the air smelled, the dizzying fog in my head, and the raw, unfiltered fear in my dad's eyes when he realized what was happening. I became obsessed with learning about carbon monoxide and propane leaks, how quickly they could fill a room, how they could put you to sleep forever without you even realizing. I bought a carbon monoxide detector for my own apartment the first chance I got, even though my friends teased me for being paranoid. But I couldn't forget that close call, couldn't forget how a tiny, invisible gas could turn a safe place into a death trap without warning. For months after, I had nightmares about waking up in the middle of the night and feeling that sweet, sickly smell creeping into my lungs. I'd jolt awake, gasping for air, half expecting to find myself back in that cabin with the old heater hissing beside me. It made me realize that danger doesn't always come with flashing lights and loud warnings. Sometimes, it sneaks up on you quietly, wrapped in the familiar comforts of home. The next winter, when we went back to the cabin, my dad and I sat down together before lighting the new heater, double-checking every valve and connection. We even kept the windows cracked, just to be safe. My mom thought we were overdoing it, but neither of us wanted to take any chances. And I could see that my dad hadn't forgotten either. He still had that haunted look in his eyes whenever he glanced at the spot where the old heater used to be. Now, whenever I visit friends or stay in a rental cabin, I bring a portable carbon monoxide detector with me. It might seem like overkill, but I'd rather be prepared than find myself in another situation where seconds make the difference between life and death. Most people don't realize how quickly carbon monoxide can build up, how it can make you too confused to realize what's happening before it's too late. It's a strange feeling, knowing that something as simple as a faulty heater could have taken us both out that night. We got lucky, but I know that not everyone does. Whenever I hear about people dying from carbon monoxide poisoning on the news, I think about how close I came to being one of those stories. And I'm reminded that sometimes, the most dangerous things are the ones you can't see. The things that seep into the air, quiet and invisible, until it's almost too late. That night in the cabin taught me a lesson I'll never forget. The importance of respecting the little things, of paying attention to that gut feeling when something doesn't seem right. And even though the cabin is safer now, I can't help but feel a little shiver whenever I walk inside, as if that invisible danger is still lingering in the corners, waiting for someone to forget. All right, let me tell you about this time I actually managed to strike up a conversation without feeling like a total weirdo. It was at this cozy little cafe that I like to work at on weekends. It's a quiet spot with good coffee, just the kind of place where people go to read or work on their laptops. I was there, doing my usual routine, sipping a cappuccino and trying to focus on a project, when I noticed this woman sitting a few tables over, completely absorbed in a thick paperback. She had one of those serious, don't bother me looks, head down, earphones in, but there was something about how focused she was that made me curious. I'm usually pretty shy, but for some reason, I couldn't help glancing over every so often. I kept telling myself, just leave it alone, she probably doesn't want to be bothered. But then, Fate kind of stepped in. At one point, she got up to grab more coffee, and as she walked back to her table, she bumped into the side of a chair and spilled a bit of her drink. It wasn't a huge mess, but she looked flustered, like she was embarrassed about making a scene. I could tell she was trying to balance the book, her phone, and the cup all at once. So I reached out with a stack of napkins and said, "Here, it happens to the best of us." She took the napkins, looking relieved, and said, "Thanks. I swear, I'm not always this clumsy." I just smiled and replied, "You're good. My coffee, and I have a complicated relationship too, can never seem to keep it from spilling." That made her laugh, and suddenly, it felt like the ice was broken. She sat back down, but this time, she took her earphones out, and I took that as a subtle sign that she might be open to a little more conversation. I didn't push it though. I just went back to my work, but after a few minutes, she looked over at me and asked, "So, what are you working on?" That turned into a whole discussion about our projects, our favorite books, and how we both loved using that cafe as a little escape from the noise of the city. I made sure to keep it light, not asking anything too personal, just chatting about stuff like the best coffee spots around town and what she was reading. She showed me the cover of her book, and we ended up talking about our favorite authors for the next 20 minutes. Eventually, when the cafe started to close up for the night, I said, "It's been nice talking. Maybe I'll see you around here again sometime." I didn't want to come on too strong, so I left it at that. But to my surprise, she offered me her number before we left, saying, "In case you need more book recommendations or want a rematch on who can find the best cappuccino in the city." What I think worked in that situation was that I didn't treat it like some high-stakes moment. It wasn't about delivering a perfect line or trying to impress her. I just helped out when she had a little mishap, and the rest flowed naturally. I never made it feel like I had an agenda. It was more like, "Hey, we're both here, let's have a nice chat while we're at it." So, my advice? Let the moment guide you. If you see a chance to help out or start a casual conversation, go for it, but don't overthink it or force it. And if she doesn't seem interested or goes back to her book or her laptop, respect that and let her be. There's no harm in trying, as long as you're ready to walk away if it's not the right time. You'll feel better about yourself, and you won't make her feel uncomfortable. When I was about 16, my little sister and I decided to camp out in the woods near our house. It was a typical teenage adventure. Nothing too crazy, just a way to escape from homework and parents for a night. Our house was right on the edge of a small forest, and we knew the area like the back of our hands. It was the kind of place where you could get lost for hours in a world of your own, following deer trails and climbing over fallen logs. We picked a spot by a little creek close enough to home that we could run back if we needed, but far enough that it felt like we were on our own. As we were setting up the tent, we noticed a man walking along the main path about 50 yards away. He was bald, wearing a faded blue shirt, and had a big dog with him. Nothing too unusual. People walk their dogs in those woods all the time. But something about him made me feel uneasy. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing over at us, or the fact that he lingered on the path longer than necessary. My sister noticed it too, because she gave me this look, eyebrows raised, like she was trying to figure out if I was getting the same bad vibes. I shook it off, not wanting to freak her out. We went back to setting up camp, trying to enjoy the evening. But that feeling of unease lingered, like the air had turned cold even though it was still summer. About half an hour later, as we were unpacking our snacks, we saw him again, this time much closer. He came up the hill from the creek, the dog trotting beside him, and waved to us. He asked if we were out here alone, if our dad was around. I lied, saying we were just on our way to meet up with him. His eyes lingered on me a bit too long before he nodded, gave a forced smile, and turned back towards the creek. My sister and I exchanged a look, something unspoken but clear. We both knew we needed to move, but we didn't want to make it obvious. So, we casually packed up our things, laughing and talking a bit louder than necessary, like we were pretending everything was fine. We decided to take a detour along a smaller, overgrown path that ran parallel to the main one, hidden behind a thick line of bushes. It was a trail we discovered years ago, barely used and almost impossible to see unless you knew it was there. As we slipped into the cover of the trees, I glanced back and saw the man watching us from the top of the hill, his dog sitting at his feet. He wasn't smiling anymore. We crept along the hidden path, moving quickly but trying to stay quiet. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could hear my sister's ragged breathing behind me. I kept glancing back to make sure she was okay, but she had that determined look on her face that I knew meant she was just as scared as I was. We reached a point where we could see through the gaps in the bushes to the main trail, and we paused, crouching low to catch our breath. I peeked out and saw him again. Only this time, he wasn't walking away. He was coming back up the path, but slower now, looking around like he was trying to find something, or someone. He reached the spot where we'd been setting up our tent, and stood there for a long moment, scanning the area with a frown on his face. Then, to my horror, he turned and started walking back in our direction, his pace quickening. We held our breath, watching as he got closer. My sister's hand gripped mine so tightly it hurt, but I didn't dare move. We waited until he passed, heading up the trail towards where he must have thought we'd gone. The second he disappeared from view, I grabbed my sister's arm, and we bolted down the hidden path, not stopping until we reached a fork where we could cut back to the road. Once we were sure we were out of sight, we crouched behind a cluster of ferns, catching our breath. I pulled out my phone, hands shaking, and snapped a blurry picture of his back as he moved away, just in case. My sister whispered, "Why was he following us?" But I didn't have an answer. I just knew we needed to get out of there fast. We sprinted all the way home, bursting through the back door, breathless and red-faced. Our mom looked up from the kitchen table, startled, but before she could ask what had happened, we both started babbling about the man, the dog, the way he had followed us. She listened, her expression turning from confusion to alarm, and immediately called the non-emergency police line, giving them the description. That evening, while we were still too jittery to sleep, my mom came into our room with a grim look on her face. She showed us a post from a local community group on her phone. It was a blurry photo of the same bald man with the dog, caught on someone's doorbell camera. The caption read, "Does anyone know this guy? Tried to break into my house yesterday. Claims he's a repairman, but I don't believe it." My stomach dropped as I read the comments. He'd been seen prowling around different neighborhoods for the past few weeks, always with that same dog, always with some half-baked excuse about being lost or looking for work. A few people mentioned that he'd try to follow them, too, but no one had been able to catch him doing anything illegal. The next few nights, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that man creeping through the woods, searching for us. And the thought of what might have happened if we hadn't known about that hidden path still sends chills down my spine. I kept the blurry photo on my phone for a long time, even though it was practically useless, just as a reminder that we'd made the right choice. Eventually, the police caught up with him after he broke into a garage a few towns over. They found tools in his car and a duffel bag filled with things you'd only carry if you weren't planning on leaving witnesses: duct tape, rope, and knife. They never linked him to any serious crimes, but the implication was clear enough. He'd been hunting in one way or another, looking for someone to catch alone. Even though they got him, I never felt safe in those woods again. The creek that used to be our secret hideaway now felt like a place where shadows lingered, where unseen eyes watched from the underbrush. My sister and I stopped going on those little adventures, sticking to the open fields closer to home. And to this day, whenever I hear the snap of a twig in the woods or catch a glimpse of movement among the trees, my heart races, and I have to remind myself that he's gone. But every so often, I think about that hidden path, the one that saved us. If we hadn't known it was there, if we'd taken a different route, would we have made it back home at all? Or would I still be out there? Just another story about a kid who went missing in the woods? It happened on a quiet Sunday, the kind where you think nothing could go wrong. I was visiting my grandparents at their house in the mountains, a place I'd always thought of as peaceful. They had this big, old farm-style home surrounded by trees, with a large basement where my grandpa kept his workshop. That basement was a wonderland of tools, old furniture, and random bits of machinery he'd collected over the years. It was a place where I'd spent many afternoons tinkering with him, learning how to fix things. That day, he'd asked me to help him replace an old hot water heater. The thing had been installed sometime in the 80s, and it was finally giving out. My grandpa, always stubborn, insisted he didn't need a plumber, that we could do it ourselves. I was in my early 20s, full of confidence from a few DIY projects, and I figured, why not? How hard could it be? We got the old heater disconnected without much trouble, and I remember feeling a bit smug about how smoothly it was going. But then we had to deal with the gas line. Grandpa warned me to be careful, showed me how to turn off the gas valve properly, and we checked it 3 times before starting. But the thing about old houses is you never know when something is just waiting to break. And that day, we found out the hard way. We were standing in the cramped space beside the heater, and I had just started loosening one of the old pipe fittings when I heard a hiss, the kind of sound that makes your heart skip a beat. At first, I thought it was just air escaping, but the smell hit me right after. That unmistakable rotten egg odor they add to natural gas. My grandpa's eyes went wide, and he yelled, "Close the valve! Close it now!" I lunged for the valve, twisting it shut, but the hissing didn't stop. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the fitting must have cracked when I was turning the wrench. Grandpa grabbed my arm, pulling me back, and barked out, "We need to get out of here! Get out now!" There was a wild look in his eyes that I'd never seen before, the kind that told me this was serious, way beyond anything we could handle ourselves. We ran up the stairs, out of the basement, and my grandpa told me to call 911 from the front yard while he grabbed my grandma and got her outside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial, the phone slipping through my sweaty fingers. I kept glancing back at the house, half expecting to see it burst into flames at any second. The dispatcher on the other end of the line told me to stay calm, but I could hear the urgency in her voice when she told us to get as far away as possible. By the time the fire department arrived, we were standing on the edge of the property, shivering despite the warm sun. A couple of firemen ran into the house with gas detectors, while others began unrolling hoses, shouting instructions to each other. I watched them work with a kind of numb detachment, my mind replaying the last few minutes over and over. I kept thinking about how close we'd been to that leak, how a single spark could have turned the whole house into an inferno. Eventually, one of the firefighters came over to tell us they'd managed to shut off the gas at the main line, but he gave us this serious look and said, "You're lucky you got out when you did. If that gas had built up any more, a single flick of a light switch could have set it off. It would have blown the whole place sky high." Hearing that, I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I looked over at my grandpa, and he just shook his head, muttering, "All these years, and I never thought it could go that wrong." For him, that house was as solid as a rock, a place where he'd raised a family and lived through blizzards and power outages. But the reality is, all it takes is one mistake, one crack in an old pipe, to bring everything crashing down. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about how close we'd come to losing everything. I'd grown up visiting that house, playing in the fields and running through the woods, and I'd always thought of it as a safe place. But now, whenever I smelled even the faintest whiff of gas, my pulse would spike, and I'd have to force myself to take deep breaths, reminding myself that it was okay, that we were okay. My grandpa never tried to fix the gas lines himself after that. He hired a professional to install the new heater, and he even added a few extra gas detectors around the house. He didn't talk much about what had happened, but I could tell it had shaken him. For someone who'd spent his whole life fixing things, admitting that there were some jobs too dangerous to handle on your own was a hard pill to swallow. I became a bit obsessive about gas safety after that, researching how to detect leaks, learning about the flammability limits, and understanding how quickly a small leak could turn into a catastrophe. I even went around my apartment checking the stove and heater connections, driving my roommates crazy with my sudden paranoia. But I couldn't forget how that gas had filled the basement, how invisible and deadly it was, how we'd almost stayed down there too long. It made me realize that some dangers are lurking right under your nose, just waiting for a moment of carelessness to strike. A few years later, I heard about a house in a nearby town that exploded because of a similar gas leak. The family had gone to bed, not realizing the furnace had a crack, and the whole place went up around midnight. They didn't make it out. Seeing the news footage of their house reduced to rubble brought all those memories flooding back. And I remember calling my grandparents just to hear their voices, just to make sure everything was still okay. Even now, I still get anxious when I hear that hiss of air escaping from a tire or a soda can. It's irrational, I know, but it's like my body remembers that day in the basement, the way my heart pounded and my hands shook as I fumbled with the valve. It's a constant reminder that the things you don't see or think about, the silent dangers, are often the ones that can kill you in seconds. Gas leaks are terrifying because they give no warning until it's too late. No flames, no smoke, just an invisible cloud that hangs in the air, waiting for the right conditions to ignite. It's a reminder that even the places we think of as safe can turn dangerous, that one wrong move can set off a chain of events that you can't take back. And whenever I visit my grandparents now, I still find myself glancing at the basement door, half expecting to hear that hiss again. I know it's irrational. Everything has been checked and rechecked. But that fear, that memory of how close we came to losing everything, lingers like the faint scent of gas in the back of my mind. It's a lesson I won't ever forget, and a reminder that sometimes safety is just a matter of seconds. It was a typical summer evening when it happened. My husband, Mark, and I were out at a family reunion at this old county park about an hour's drive from our home. It was one of those parks that had seen better days: cracked basketball courts, rusting playground equipment, and a little lake that had once been popular but was now more a home for frogs than swimmers. The kind of place where people didn't mind leaving their cars unlocked because, well, who would bother with a place like this? There were about 30 of us, mostly cousins and aunts, grilling burgers, kids playing soccer, and the adults catching up. The sky had started to darken, and a cool breeze was blowing in, so people were beginning to move things inside one of the old rental buildings. Afternoon storms were common this time of year, but there was something different about this one. Something that made the air feel heavy, like the atmosphere was waiting for something to break. I remember standing there, holding a plate of hot dogs, when I suddenly felt this wave of dread wash over me. It hit me so hard that I had to steady myself against the picnic table. My heart started racing, and I couldn't figure out why. Everything looked normal, just a bunch of family members milling around, the distant roll of thunder. But something deep inside me was screaming that we needed to leave now. I looked over at Mark, who was helping our daughter put away the soccer ball, and I tried to shake off the feeling. But it only got worse, like a pit opening up in my stomach. I knew, without a doubt, that if we stayed, something terrible was going to happen. I walked over to Mark, grabbing his arm with more force than I meant to. "We have to go," I blurted out. He gave me a strange look, like I'd lost my mind. "Seriously, I just had a really bad feeling. We need to leave. Now." He frowned, glancing around at the sky. "It's just a storm, Jess. Everyone's going inside to wait it out." But I couldn't shake it. I felt like I was about to crawl out of my skin, like every nerve in my body was screaming at me to run. I must have looked pale because Mark's expression softened, and he put a hand on my shoulder. Okay, let's go." I hurried over to our daughter, telling her to get in the car, and Mark called out to his brother, saying we were heading out early. The rest of the family waved us off, looking puzzled but not overly concerned. We piled into our old sedan, and I buckled our daughter in her car seat with shaking hands. Mark gave me a worried glance as he started the engine, but I just whispered, "Let's just get out of here." As we pulled out of the park, I felt a little of the tension ease out of my shoulders, like I could finally breathe again. But then, just as we were leaving the park's entrance, the tornado sirens went off. Loud, shrill, and terrifyingly close. My heart jumped into my throat as I looked out the window, and that's when I saw it. In the distance, across the lake, a funnel cloud was dropping down from the churning sky, swirling faster and faster. It looked like a scene from a disaster movie, only it was real, and it was heading straight toward the park. Mark swore under his breath, slamming the gas pedal as we sped down the winding country road. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold onto the door handle, my eyes fixed on the growing twister. We barely made it a few miles down the road when the wind picked up, whipping branches and debris across our path. Mark kept driving, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, and I clung to our daughter's hand in the back seat, whispering that everything was going to be okay, even though I didn't know if it was true. When we reached a gas station further down the road, we pulled in, and I fumbled with the radio, trying to find a weather update. The emergency broadcast was blaring, warning people to take cover immediately, listing the areas under threat. And right there, in the middle of it all, was the name of the park we just left. I thought about my family back there, still in the old rental building, with no idea what was coming their way. I grabbed my phone, dialing my brother-in-law's number with shaking fingers. He picked up after a few rings, and I could hear the chaos in the background. Kids crying, the adults shouting as they scrambled for the cars. I told him about the tornado, told him to get out of there, and he just kept saying, oh God, Jess, it's coming right at us." We stayed on the line until I heard him shout for everyone to get down, the sound of roaring wind filling the connection before it went dead. I thought my heart might stop. Mark held me while I shook, listening to the sirens wail in the distance. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes before my brother-in-law called back. He told me that most of the family had made it out, but a few cars had been caught up in the chaos, knocked around by the wind. The building where they'd taken cover had been torn apart, completely flattened, nothing but a concrete slab left behind. When the storm finally passed, we drove back to the park, finding it unrecognizable. Trees were snapped in half like matchsticks, the rental building was reduced to splinters, and the lake looked like a bomb had gone off nearby, filled with debris and downed branches. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I hugged my relatives, everyone talking over each other, trying to piece together what had happened. I'll never forget the look on Mark's face as he stood there, staring at the remains of the building where we'd been just an hour before. "How did you know?" he asked quietly. "How did you know we had to leave?" I didn't have an answer then, and I still don't. It wasn't logic or reason or anything I could explain. It was just this deep gut-level certainty that if we'd stayed even a few minutes longer, we wouldn't have made it out. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about that funnel cloud, dreams where it was coming for me, moving faster than I could run, swallowing up everything in its path. Even now, years later, I can still hear the sound of the sirens in my head, feel the rush of the wind against my skin, and the way my heart pounded in my chest as we raced down that road. We haven't gone back to that park since. It's mostly abandoned now, the county never bothering to rebuild. But sometimes, when we drive past it on our way to visit family, I glance over at the twisted trees and think about how close we came to losing everything that day. And I still think whatever part of me listened to that gut feeling, that unexplainable sense that something was coming, something that wouldn't have let us leave if we'd stayed any longer. I guess it's time I admit something. I've been taking care of my partner's late father's garden for almost a year now, and she has no idea. Her dad passed away last year, and he was absolutely obsessed with his garden. It's this beautiful, sprawling thing behind their old house, flowers, herbs, fruit trees, you name it. I never paid much attention to gardening before I met her, but I knew how much it meant to her dad. He'd spend hours out there, and she used to tell me stories about how, when she was little, they'd plant sunflowers together every spring. It was their thing. After he passed, she had a really hard time going back there. She tried once or twice, but I could tell it was too painful for her. The house is still in the family, but she couldn't bring herself to visit it much, especially not the garden. It's like every time she thought about it, she'd just get this faraway look in her eyes. I knew she was scared that if she went back and saw it overgrown, it would feel like losing another piece of him. So, I took it upon myself to keep it going. One Saturday morning, while she was working a weekend shift, I drove over to the house and just started, figuring it out. At first, I barely knew what I was doing. I'd never even used a pair of pruning shears before, let alone figured out how to revive an old tomato plant or weed around a rose bush. I killed a few things right off the bat, accidentally pulled up some herbs thinking they were weeds, and overwatered this poor lavender bush until it nearly drowned. But then I started reading up on it, buying a few gardening books, even watching some videos. Every other Saturday, I'd head over there with gloves, a trowel, and whatever new seeds or plants I thought might do well. I even went as far as asking her mom about her dad's favorite plants, the ones he'd always tried to grow, but never quite managed. Turns out, he'd always wanted to get an apple tree to flourish, but the last one he planted had died the year before he got sick. So I bought a sapling. It took me hours to dig the hole and make sure everything was just right, but I finally got it planted in a sunny spot. I've been taking care of that tree like it's my own personal mission, watering it, keeping the pests away, and crossing my fingers that it'll start growing strong roots. I can't help but think of how proud her dad would be if he saw it. Every time I'm out there, it's like this little ritual. I'll put on some old classic rock, her dad's favorite, and get to work. The place still has that peaceful, earthy smell that lingers after it rains, and sometimes I swear I can almost hear him telling me what to do, like cut those branches back, they're crowding the marigolds, or watch out for the slugs in the lettuce. It's probably just my imagination, but it's comforting in a way, like I'm doing right by him. I know she'd be surprised if she knew, but I also think she'd be touched. I keep imagining this scene where I take her back there one day, just casually suggesting we visit her dad's place for old time's sake. And when she steps out into the garden, she'll see that it's still thriving, just like he left it. Maybe she'll even notice the apple tree and realize that I've been putting in all this effort to keep a piece of her dad's memory alive. But I also know that she's got a lot of emotions tied up in that place, so I've been waiting for the right moment. There's this little part of me that's scared too, like what if she thinks it's overstepping? What if she sees all my clumsy attempts at keeping things alive and just feels like I've messed with something sacred? But deep down, I think she'd appreciate knowing that I cared enough to try. Now that it's fall, I'm almost done planting bulbs that will bloom next spring. Tulips, daffodils, all those bright, happy flowers that her dad used to love. I keep picturing the look on her face when she sees them for the first time, how her eyes might light up with that mix of surprise and nostalgia. I hope it'll be a way for her to feel close to him again, in a way that doesn't hurt so much. I know it might sound silly to some people, but for me, it's become this really personal thing. Like, I never got the chance to know her dad while he was alive, but this has been my way of connecting with him, of understanding a part of her that I never got to see. And if this little garden can bring her even a fraction of the peace it's given me, then it'll all be worth it. So yeah, that's my secret. I'm a guy who learned how to garden just to keep a piece of her dad's memory alive. I never thought I'd find myself pulling weeds and worrying about soil acidity, but here I am. And maybe someday soon, when the apple tree starts to bloom, I'll finally find the courage to share it all with her. One of the scariest things I learned during my time working in an industrial setting is just how dangerous certain types of tension equipment can be. Things like wire ropes, heavy-duty springs, or high-tension cables. Most people have no idea that these things can store massive amounts of energy. When you release that tension in the wrong way, it's like setting off a bomb. I remember the first time I really understood how lethal these forces could be. I was in my early 20s, working as an apprentice at a construction site. There was this older guy, Steve, who'd been doing the job for decades. He'd seen it all, or so I thought. He was the kind of guy who would laugh off safety warnings, saying, "I've been doing this longer than you've been alive, kid." But one day, he got a reminder that experience doesn't make you invincible. We were working on a crane setup, adjusting a massive steel cable that had gotten slightly out of alignment. I was standing nearby, holding the toolbox, while Steve tightened one of the bolts that anchored the cable to the base. He grumbled about how the new guys had messed it up, and I just nodded along, trying not to get in his way. I didn't know much back then, just that this cable seemed to hum with tension, almost vibrating under the strain. That's when it happened. Steve made one last twist with the wrench, and suddenly there was this snap like a gunshot. I felt the air around us shift, and everything seemed to slow down. The cable whipped loose, recoiling with a force I couldn't have imagined. It hit Steve square in the chest, throwing him back like a rag doll. He didn't even have time to scream, just a grunt as he hit the ground, his face twisted in shock. 1 second he was there, and the next he was on his back, unmoving, the breath knocked out of him forever. I remember dropping the toolbox, my hands shaking so hard I couldn't pick it back up. Someone shouted for an ambulance, but we all knew it was pointless. The cable had crushed his chest, leaving a deep indentation that didn't seem possible on a human body. I couldn't stop staring at that cable, lying slack on the ground now like a snake that had just struck. It looked so harmless lying there, but a few seconds earlier, it had been a lethal weapon, all that stored energy released in a split second. The paramedics showed up, but they couldn't do anything except confirm what we already knew. We all stood around in silence, the realization sinking in. It wasn't just a freak accident. It was a reminder of how little room for error there was around these machines. The site supervisor shut everything down for the rest of the day, saying we'd need time to regroup and figure out what had gone wrong. But I think he knew, just like the rest of us, that sometimes things go wrong faster than you can react, no matter how careful you are. The aftermath stuck with me for weeks. I had nightmares about cables snapping, flinched at every loud noise, and couldn't stop thinking about the look on Steve's face in those last moments. But what really got to me was how easily it could have been me. A few inches to the right, a little less slack on that cable, and I could have been the one lying on the ground. From that day on, I developed a healthy respect for anything under tension, whether it was a cable, a spring, or even something as simple as a ratchet strap. I became that guy, the one who double-checked every connection, who always insisted on using extra safety measures. Even when people rolled their eyes and said I was being paranoid, I didn't care. I'd seen what could happen when things go wrong, and I wasn't about to let my guard down. And it's not just industrial equipment that carries that kind of danger. A few years later, I had a close call that drove that point home all over again. It was a weekend, and I was helping a neighbor fix his garage door. The spring had broken, and he'd picked up a replacement, figuring we could handle the job ourselves. I warned him that those springs were dangerous, that the tension in them could be lethal if they snapped loose, but he brushed me off, saying, "It's just a garage door. How bad could it be?" I remember standing there, watching as he hooked the new spring into place. He was using a makeshift tool, a length of rebar that wasn't really meant for the job. I could see the tension building in the spring as he tightened it, winding it tighter and tighter. My gut was telling me to step back, but I didn't want to seem like a coward. So I stayed right where I was, holding onto the other end of the door track. Then, just like with Steve, there was that snap. The rebar slipped out of his hands, and the spring whipped around, lashing through the air like a striking cobra. It missed my face by inches, close enough that I felt the breeze as it whipped past. It shattered the window in the garage door, spraying glass everywhere. My neighbor fell backward, landing hard on the concrete, but he was lucky. The spring had missed him too, tearing through the side of his tool bench instead. We sat there for a long time, both of us breathing hard, staring at the destruction. He muttered something about how he should have listened to me, but I barely heard him. All I could think about was how easily that spring could have taken my head off, how close I'd come to ending up like Steve. It was one of those moments where you realize just how fragile you are, how little it takes to snuff out a life. After that, I made a rule for myself: never mess with high-tension anything, not even if it seems simple. I hired professionals to fix my own garage door the next time it needed work, and I made sure my neighbor did the same. He grumbled about the expense, but I reminded him that it was cheaper than a funeral. I try to pass that lesson on to others whenever I can. You'd be surprised how many people think they can handle these things themselves just because they've seen a few videos online or they're trying to save a buck. I've seen them try to replace boat lines, adjust power lines, even fiddle with the springs in old mattresses without a second thought. But I always tell them that tension's like a loaded gun, just waiting to go off. Most people laugh it off, thinking I'm exaggerating. But I can still see that moment when the cable snapped and hear the sound it made as it hit Steve. It's not something I can ever forget. And every time I hear about someone getting killed in a freak accident like that, I feel a shiver run down my spine, knowing how easily it could have been me. It's strange how something so simple, so invisible, can hold so much power. How a cable, a spring, or even a rope can carry the potential to end a life in a heartbeat. But I guess that's the scariest part. The idea that danger can be hidden in the things we take for granted, just waiting for a moment of carelessness to strike. And when it does, there's no time to react. 1 second you're standing there, and the next, you're not. All right, here's a time when I actually managed to get it right. No awkward vibes, no pressure, just a genuine connection. It was at this community trivia night at a local pub. I'm a bit of a trivia nerd, and I figured it would be a fun way to spend a Thursday evening. The place was packed, groups huddled around tables, drinks in hand, people laughing and throwing out random guesses for the questions. I was sitting by myself, waiting for the trivia to start, when I noticed a woman at a nearby table struggling to fill out her team's sign-up sheet. She kept crossing out team names, looking like she couldn't decide on one. I thought it was the perfect opportunity for a lighthearted, no-pressure interaction. So I leaned over and said, "If you're open to suggestions, I have a few terrible team name ideas I've been sitting on." She laughed, which was a good start, and replied, "Sure, let's hear them. I could use some inspiration." So I threw out a couple of silly names: Trivia Newton-John, the Quizzards of Oz, Nothing serious, just fun. We ended up chatting back and forth about the worst team names we'd ever heard, and pretty soon, her friends joined in. It turned into this little game before the trivia even began. Eventually, she asked, "Are you here with the team?" I shrugged and said, "Nope, just me and my encyclopedic knowledge of random facts." She smiled and asked if I wanted to join her group since they were short a person. I figured, why not? And I slid over to their table. It was a blast. We bantered all night about the trivia questions, argued over the best pizza toppings, and even went a round or two. But I didn't push for anything romantic. I just focused on having fun and being part of the group. At the end of the night, as we were all packing up, I said, "This was a lot of fun. If you guys ever need a trivia ringer again, just let me know." She paused for a second, then handed me her phone. "Here, put your number in. Maybe we'll do a rematch sometime." It felt so natural. No grand gestures, no awkward pickup lines, just a good time that turned into something more. The trivia night gave us something to talk about right away, and I didn't feel any pressure to make a move. We were just two people who happened to enjoy each other's company while trying to figure out which 90s TV show theme song was playing over the speakers. What I've learned from that experience is that sometimes the best way to approach someone is to let the situation do the work for you. I didn't have to come up with a brilliant opener or try to impress her with some rehearsed line. I just joined in on the fun and let things unfold naturally. So my advice? Don't overthink the approach. Focus on enjoying the moment. Look for those little opportunities where you can join in on whatever's already happening. It takes the pressure off, makes the whole thing feel a lot less forced, and gives you both a chance to connect over something you're both enjoying. And if she's into it, she'll let you know. Trust me. Doesn't I need to go home now feeling count? It wasn't me, but my mom. And to this day, I have no idea how she knew. I was around 12, and it was one of those lazy Saturdays where nothing much happened. My mom had gone out to run errands, probably to pick up groceries or visit the post office. And I stayed home, enjoying the rare bit of alone time. We live in a small house on a hill with only 2 neighbors, both of whom kept to themselves. There were thick trees all around, a kind of natural barrier that made the place feel isolated but safe. Not long after she left, the doorbell rang. It startled me because we never got visitors, especially not unannounced. I remember hesitating, my hand halfway to the doorknob, and then pausing. Something felt off, like the air was suddenly colder. Thanks to a mirror we had angled near the entryway, I could peek out without being seen. Through a narrow gap, I saw a young man I didn't recognize standing on our front porch. He was dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans, but something about the way he held himself felt wrong. Too casual, like he was trying to blend in. I didn't answer, just watched him for a while, heart thudding in my chest. He didn't knock again. Instead, he pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and just lingered. Who smokes a cigarette in front of a stranger's house? Not saying a word. My mind raced through scenarios. Should I call my mom? Try to hide? But the phone was in the kitchen, and to reach it, I'd have to walk past the front window where he might see me. So I stayed crouched, my breath coming in shallow. Panic bursts, hoping he'd leave. After a few minutes, he walked away from the door, disappearing down the steps. I thought that was the end of it, but instead of leaving, he circled around the side of the house. I caught glimpses of him through the living room windows, moving slowly, looking around like he was casing the place. I remember pressing my back against the wall, willing myself to be invisible, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But then I saw his shadow move past the window again, this time slower, more deliberate. And just as I thought I might have to make a run for it, I heard the sound of tires crunching up our gravel driveway. My mom's car. Relief flooded through me, and I felt like I could finally breathe again. She burst through the front door, looking frantic, her face flushed. Before I could even tell her what was happening, she blurted out, "Are you okay? What happened?" I tried to explain as best as I could, about the man, the cigarette, the way he'd circled the house. But as I spoke, her expression shifted from worry to something harder, like she was fighting to stay calm. She stepped back outside, right as the man emerged from behind the garage. He seemed surprised to see her and mumbled something about looking for a lost dog, though he didn't have a leash or a collar, not even a whistle to call for a pet. My mom wasn't buying it, and neither was I. She told him, in the coldest tone I'd ever heard from her, "You need to leave. Now." He hesitated, as if considering whether he should push it, but then he seemed to think better of it. With a half-hearted shrug, he sauntered back to his car, a beat-up sedan I hadn't noticed before, and drove off, tires crunching loudly as he disappeared down the hill. After he left, my mom made sure every door and window was locked. She called the police, who came by and took our statement, but there wasn't much they could do. The officer mentioned they'd keep an eye out for the guy, but admitted he might have just been some weirdo passing through. Still, that explanation never sat right with either of us. Later, when things had calmed down, I asked my mom why she'd come back so soon. She hadn't even made it to her first stop, she told me. Just got this overwhelming, bone-deep urge to turn around and head home. She couldn't explain it, but the feeling was so strong it made her stomach twist in knots. She joked that maybe it was a mother's intuition, but I could tell it unnerved her too. She wouldn't let me stay home alone for weeks after that, even during the day. What really stuck with me, though, was the look on that guy's face when he saw my mom pull up, like he wasn't expecting anyone to come back so soon, and it had thrown off whatever plan he'd been forming. And the way he'd walked around our house, checking windows and doors, like he was looking for a way in. That image haunted my sleep for a long time. Months later, a news story came on about a man arrested a few towns over for a string of break-ins and home invasions. The sketch they showed looked eerily similar to the man who had been on our porch, same scruffy hair, same hollow eyes. I remember turning to my mom, seeing her go pale as she stared at the screen, and we both knew without saying it that it could have been us. It's strange looking back. There's no logical reason why my mom should have had that feeling, but if she hadn't turned around, I don't like to think about what might have happened. Sometimes I wonder if he knew I was inside, hiding behind the wall, watching him through the cracks. And if my mom's intuition hadn't kicked in, would he have found a way inside? Even now, over a decade later, I find myself glancing over my shoulder whenever I'm alone in the house, especially when it gets quiet. I'll check the locks, look out the window into the darkness beyond, and think of that guy's shadow moving around the corner of the house. I'm thankful every day that my mom trusted her instincts that afternoon, even if we'll never understand exactly why. And to this day, every time she drops me a text saying, "Just checking in, all good?" I know it's not just casual. She's still looking out for that danger, still listening to that gut feeling that kept us both safe. This happened a few years ago when I took a road trip with a couple of friends through the American Southwest. We had this grand plan: rent a car, load up on snacks, and spend 2 weeks exploring all the places we'd only ever seen in photos. We mapped out a route that took us through national parks, small towns, and long stretches of empty desert highways where you could drive for miles without seeing another car. It was supposed to be an adventure, a break from our routines. And it was until we found out just how quickly things can go wrong when you're in the middle of nowhere. We were somewhere between Utah and Nevada, driving down a desolate road that cut straight through miles of barren land. There were no gas stations, no signs of civilization, just the occasional tumbleweed and the shimmering heat rising off the asphalt. The sun was blazing overhead, turning the car into an oven despite the AC blasting on high. It felt like we were the only people left on the planet. After hours of driving, our friend Lisa, who was behind the wheel, started talking about taking a shortcut she'd read about online, something that would cut a couple of hours off our trip. It was one of those old, unpaved roads that wind through the desert, barely more than a dusty track. We were all a little skeptical, but we figured, why not? We've been driving on empty roads all day, and what's an adventure without a little risk? At first, it was fun, bumping along the dirt track, kicking up a cloud of dust behind us. But as we got further from the highway, the landscape started to change. The ground became more uneven, the hills steeper, and the ruts in the road deeper. And then, just as we crested a hill, the car lurched forward and stopped dead with a sickening jolt. Lisa swore, trying to start the car again, but all we heard was a grinding noise and the sound of the engine turning over without catching. We got out to see what had happened and found the front end of the car buried in a ditch, one of the tires sunk into soft sand. No matter how much we tried pushing or shoving, the car wouldn't budge. It was like the desert itself was holding us in place. At first, we laughed it off, thinking we'd just call for a tow. But when we checked our phones, we realized we had no service, not a single bar. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert, and the heat was still radiating off the ground, making it feel like we were standing in an oven. We tried everything we could think of, using the car mats for traction, piling rocks behind the wheels, but nothing worked. Each time we tried, the car seemed to sink a little deeper, the sand swallowing it inch by inch. After about an hour, it started to dawn on us that we were in serious trouble. We hadn't seen another car in hours, and the nearest town was at least 30 miles back, too far to walk before nightfall. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature started to drop fast. The desert went from scorching to freezing in a matter of minutes, and we hadn't packed much for warmth, just a few hoodies and blankets. We huddled together in the car, listening to the silence that stretched out for miles, interrupted only by the occasional rustling sound of the wind against the car's windows. It was eerie how quickly the vast emptiness around us went from being thrilling to terrifying. Lisa tried to stay positive, saying that someone would drive by eventually, but I could see the fear creeping into her eyes. And deep down, we all knew that we'd made a stupid mistake, taking that shortcut without thinking about what might happen if things went wrong. That night was the longest of my life. The temperature dropped below freezing, and our breath fogged up the windows. We took turns trying to sleep, but it was impossible with the cold creeping into our bones. At one point, we turned on the car's engine just to get a few minutes of heat, but we didn't dare keep it running for long, not knowing how much gas we had left. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured news stories about people found stranded in the desert, their cars half buried in the sand, no one finding them until it was too late. By the time the sun rose, we were exhausted, shivering, and more than a little scared. Our water supply was running low, and there was no sign of anyone coming down the road. We decided that one of us should try to walk back to the highway while the others stayed with the car. But as soon as we stepped outside, the reality of the situation hit us. The landscape stretched out endlessly in every direction, a sea of sand and rock under a merciless sun. We were debating our options, trying to keep our voices calm, when we heard a faint sound in the distance, the rumble of an engine. I scrambled up the nearest hill, straining my eyes against the glare, and saw a dust cloud rising on the horizon. It was a pickup truck, moving slowly but steadily toward us, and I felt this surge of hope so strong it nearly knocked me over. When the truck finally reached us, the driver, a middle-aged guy with sun-weathered skin and a cowboy hat, looked us over and shook his head, muttering about city folks getting themselves stuck in the middle of nowhere. But he was kind enough to pull our car out of the ditch with a tow strap, the engine of his truck growling as he hauled us back on a firmer ground. He told us we were lucky he decided to take the old road that morning. Normally, he never used that route, but he'd been checking up on an old well nearby. As we got back on the road, I couldn't shake the feeling of how close we'd come to being stranded out there for good. The desert was beautiful in its own way, but it had a kind of cold indifference that I hadn't seen before. It didn't care about our plans or how prepared we thought we were. It just waited, silent and empty, ready to swallow us up without a trace. We stuck to the main roads after that, not caring that it took longer to reach our next stop. And every time we drove past a stretch of open desert, I'd glance out the window, imagining our car still stuck out there, half buried in the sand, with nothing but the wind and the sun for company. When I got home, I did some reading about desert survival, about how quickly dehydration and hypothermia can set in, even when you think you're prepared. I learned that many people who get lost in places like that don't die from the heat. They die from the cold, from the disorientation that sets in when you're surrounded by nothing but endless horizons. The whole experience changed the way I look at road trips, at taking risks in places where help isn't just a phone call away. Now, whenever I travel, I make sure I've got extra water, a full tank of gas, and a healthy respect for the places that lie between the towns and cities. Because sometimes, it's not the big dangers that get you. It's the empty spaces, the miles of nothing, and the mistakes that you don't realize are mistakes until it's too late. Even now, years later, I can still feel that chill of fear whenever I think about that night in the desert, the way the stars look so distant and uncaring above us. It's a reminder that no matter how confident you feel, no matter how much you plan, the world has a way of humbling you when you least expect it. And all it takes is one wrong turn, one cracked road, to find yourself at the mercy of a place that was never meant to keep you safe. I've worked as a bartender for years, and over time, you get a sense for people, a gut feeling when something's off. Most of the time, it's nothing more than a guy getting a little too drunk or a couple arguing at the end of the bar. But there was one night that feeling turned into something I'll never forget, the kind that still makes my skin crawl whenever I think about it. It started like any other Saturday night. Loud, busy, people laughing, music blasting. Around midnight, this guy comes in, big dude, kind of shabby looking with missing fingers on one hand. He's got this intense look in his eyes, muttering to himself under his breath as he orders a drink. I remember asking him to repeat himself a couple of times because I couldn't catch what he was saying. He glared at me like I was the problem, but I just shrugged it off. You deal with a lot of weird characters in this job. But then he started getting aggressive. It wasn't directed at me at first. He was making these nasty comments about some of the other customers, mumbling stuff like, "I'll show them, they don't know who they're dealing with." I kept an eye on him, and when he started swearing loudly and slamming his glass down, I told him he'd had enough. I had to kick him out before things got worse, which he did, but not before giving me this look, a look that chilled me right to the bone. He stared me down, eyes wide and unblinking, and said, "You're gonna regret this. I'll make sure of it." I brushed it off at the time. Just another drunk who couldn't handle being told no. But even after he left, the bar felt different, like a shadow had crept in behind the noise and laughter. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I served drinks, half expecting to see him standing outside the window, watching me. I even mentioned it to one of the regulars, but he just laughed and told me to take a shot and lighten up. Closing time rolled around, and I stayed back alone to count the money and close up, like I always did. By then, the street outside was dead quiet, just the hum of the neon sign in the window and the occasional car passing by. As I was finishing up, that uneasy feeling came back, stronger than before, like there was something just outside my field of vision, watching me. I glanced out the front window, but all I saw was the empty sidewalk stretching out under the streetlights. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd let the guy get in my head. But then I looked out again, just as I was about to grab my jacket, and that's when I saw him. He was standing on the corner across the street, partially hidden in the shadow of a streetlight. Even from that distance, I recognized his build, the slouch of his shoulders, and the way he tilted his head slightly to one side. But now he was wearing a ski mask, the kind you'd expect to see on a bank robber in a movie. My blood ran cold. It felt like time slowed down, like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. I dialed 911, my voice barely more than a whisper as I tried to explain what was happening. The dispatcher kept asking if I was sure he was the same guy from earlier, but I couldn't think straight. I just kept saying, "He's watching me. He's right there, staring at me." By the time the cops arrived, he was gone. They checked the area, found nothing, and assured me that he'd probably just been trying to scare me. They offered to give me a ride home, but I declined, figuring I'd already wasted enough of their time. The moment they left, I practically ran to my car, checking the shadows all the way to the driver's seat. The whole way home, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that ski mask staring back at me from the back seat. I managed to get home, lock the doors, and try to convince myself that it was over, that the guy had just been trying to mess with me and wouldn't bother me again. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that mask, those cold, unblinking eyes staring at me through the glass. I must have checked the locks a dozen times before morning, every little sound making my heart jump. A couple of days later, I got a call from the police. They told me they picked up the guy after he'd been spotted lurking around another bar on the opposite side of town. He had a knife on him, along with a crumpled piece of paper with my bar's address scrawled on it. They couldn't prove he'd been planning anything, but the implication was enough to make me feel sick. After that, he became a fixture in the town rumor mill. People talked about seeing him muttering to himself outside the grocery store, or catching him lurking around the edges of parking lots. Everyone knew he was trouble, but he seemed to slip through the cracks every time, never quite doing enough to land himself in jail for long. The cops kept an eye on him, but they couldn't watch him all the time. One night, months after that first encounter, I got a call from a friend who lived a few blocks away. She told me she'd seen the guy again, standing outside her apartment, just staring up at her window. She swore she saw him holding something in his hand, a length of rope, maybe, or a crowbar, but he disappeared into the shadows before she could get a closer look. She was terrified, and so was I, but what could we do besides warn the cops and hope for the best? I never saw him again after that, but knowing he was out there, still holding that grudge, still lurking around, kept me on edge for years. I switched bars, started parking closer to the entrance, and never stayed behind alone after closing time. It's been years now, but I still find myself checking over my shoulder whenever I walk to my car at night, that old fear creeping back in whenever I hear a footstep that seems too close. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I think about that night, about the way he stood in the shadows, watching me. I'll wonder what would have happened if I hadn't seen him when I did. If he'd caught me unaware as I walked to my car, or if he'd been waiting just a little longer, hiding behind the corner until the police had left. They never found any evidence that he was planning to hurt me that night, but in my gut, I know that look in his eyes wasn't just anger. It was the kind of simmering, quiet rage that doesn't just go away. It's the kind that sticks with you, that keeps you up at night, wondering what could have been. And I'll never forget the way his eyes shone through the holes in that ski mask, cold, flat, and filled with something I never want to see again. This one's a bit weird, but here we go. For the last year, I've been secretly learning how to fix cars. Now, I know that might not sound like a big deal, but trust me, it's a whole thing in our relationship. My partner's dad is a retired mechanic, and she practically grew up in his shop, learning how to change tires before she even learned how to drive. Me? I'm the guy who calls AAA for a dead battery. I've always been the type who would rather just pay someone else to fix my car than get my hands dirty. But last year, when my partner's car broke down and I watched her go through the whole process of fixing it herself, engine grease on her hands, hair tied up in a bandana, looking like the coolest person I've ever seen, I realized something. She's always been the one taking care of everything, always the practical one, and I wanted to find a way to meet her halfway on that. I wanted to be able to help out instead of just watching from the sidelines with a toolbox I didn't know how to use. So, I started watching YouTube tutorials. At first, it was just stuff like how to change your oil or how to jumpstart a car, but then I got deeper into it. I found this whole community of people online, sharing tips and tricks, even hosting live streams where they'd answer questions in real time. I'd tune in with my phone on silent while pretending to read a book or catch up on work emails. It was this whole secret world I never thought I'd get into, but there I was learning about carburetors and torque settings. Then I got bolder. I started taking our old car to this local garage on weekends when she thought I was out running errands. I'd chat up the mechanics, ask them questions, even convince them to let me help out with small things, just swapping out a headlight or checking the brake fluid. They probably thought I was just a curious guy with too much free time, but really, I was trying to pick up as much as I could without tipping her off. I nearly blew my cover a couple of times. There was this one Saturday when I came home with oil stains on my jeans, and she gave me this look like, "What have you been up to?" I mumbled something about helping a friend with their car, and she just laughed and said, "That's not really your style, is it?" I shrugged and changed the subject, but inside, I was sweating bullets. Another time, she asked me to hold a flashlight while she worked under the hood, and I almost blurted out advice I'd heard from a mechanic buddy earlier that week. I had to bite my tongue and pretend I didn't know the difference between a wrench and a socket. But here's the thing, it's actually been kind of fun. Like, I never thought I'd enjoy working with my hands, but there's something satisfying about seeing a problem and knowing how to fix it, even if it's just a small one. And every time I figure out something new, I picture how surprised she's going to be when I finally reveal what I've been up to. See, I've got this plan. Her birthday is coming up in a few weeks, and I've been fixing up this old motorcycle she's had sitting in our garage for years. It's one of those projects she's always wanted to get around to, but never had the time. Some old classic that her dad gave her before he retired. The thing is, it's been rusting away, with parts that haven't run in ages. But I've been working on it, bit by bit, sneaking out to the garage late at night after she falls asleep, or spending a few hours on it when she's visiting her mom. I managed to get a new battery installed, replaced the brake lines, even got the engine running smoothly again. The last thing I need to do is touch up the paint job, which has been tricky to hide because our trash bin is full of empty spray paint cans. I think I've managed to keep her from noticing, though she did ask why I suddenly have a fascination with cleaning out the garage every other weekend. My plan is to wheel it out on her birthday morning with a big red bow on it. I've already imagined the look on her face a million times. She'll probably think I had some mechanic fix it up as a gift, and I can't wait to see her reaction when I tell her that I was the one who did the work. I even have this cheesy little speech prepared about how she's always been the strong one, and I wanted to show her that I'm capable of being that for her too. It's nerve-wracking, honestly. There's a part of me that worries she might be upset that I kept this whole thing a secret, or that maybe she'll think I've been wasting my time. But I think about all the times she's been patient with me when I struggled with something new, how she always has my back, and I just want to be able to do that for her, even if it's in my own awkward, roundabout way. So yeah, that's my secret. I've been turning into a wannabe mechanic in my spare time, all for the chance to see that big, beautiful smile when she realizes what I've been up to. And who knows, maybe this time, when she asks me to hold the flashlight, I'll actually know what I'm doing. So, this is how I managed to approach someone without it getting weird. At least I hope so. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was at a local dog park with my best friend's dog. He'd asked me to watch his golden retriever, Buddy, for the weekend, and since I don't have a dog myself, I figured it'd be a nice excuse to spend some time outside. The park was full of people, and it was one of those warm days when everyone was in a good mood. Buddy's a friendly guy, so he ran up to a bunch of dogs, including this sweet little corgi whose owner caught my eye. She was sitting on a bench nearby, laughing as Buddy and her dog chased each other around. I didn't want to come off too strong, so I let the dogs do the introduction. After a minute, I walked over with Buddy on his leash and said, "Hey, sorry if Buddy's being a little too excited. He thinks every dog is his new best friend." She laughed and shook her head. "No worries, he's adorable. I think they're having a great time together." That was my cue. I kept it light, just talking about the dogs, like how her corgi was ridiculously fast for those tiny legs, and how Buddy thought he was smaller than he actually was. I figured it was a good way to break the ice without it feeling like I was coming on too strong. After a few minutes, I introduced myself, just casually like, "By the way, I'm Alex, and this is Buddy, although he's not actually mine. I'm just borrowing him for the weekend." She introduced herself too, and we ended up chatting about dog breeds, our favorite parks in the city, and even a bit about how much we both missed traveling since the pandemic. It was just a normal conversation. No pressure, no trying to impress her, just two people enjoying a sunny day with some dogs. What really made it work, I think, was that I never pushed things. At one point, her phone buzzed, and she said she had to meet a friend for lunch. I didn't try to convince her to stay or make it awkward. I just said, "Well, it was great talking to you. Maybe I'll see you around here again sometime." I didn't even ask for her number right then. I wanted to make sure she felt comfortable and didn't feel like I was rushing anything. But to my surprise, she pulled out a card with her name and number on it and said, "If you ever want to bring Buddy around again, give me a call." I was honestly a little shocked, but I played it cool, just thanked her and put the card in my pocket. We ended up meeting for coffee a few weeks later, and while it didn't turn into anything super serious, we both had a great time. What I learned from that day is that sometimes the best way to approach someone is to take it slow, focus on the moment, and let things develop naturally. It wasn't about delivering a perfect line or trying to be overly confident. It was just about being friendly, sharing a laugh, and making sure she had an easy way to walk away if she wanted to. The dogs gave us a natural connection to start with, and I just went with it. So, my advice? Find a common ground, even if it's as simple as the weather or what's going on around you. Keep it light, don't hover, and make sure she has an easy way out if she's not interested. And if she is, well, then you'll know, and you can take it from there without any pressure. It's better for everyone that way. Alright, here's how I stumbled into an approach that actually worked out. A few months back, I was at this little neighborhood bookstore, the kind that has a coffee shop inside. It's a cozy place, with shelves packed tight, and that comforting smell of old paper. I'd gone there to browse through the sci-fi section, but after a while, I noticed a woman nearby, flipping through a stack of poetry books at one of the tables. She seemed really absorbed, like she was lost in whatever she was reading. I didn't want to just walk up and interrupt her. I mean, I know how much I hate it when I'm in the middle of something and someone decides it's a great time to chat. So I kept my distance, wandered through a few more aisles, and waited until she put the book down and got up to grab another coffee. As she stood in line at the coffee counter, I saw my chance. I walked up, kept a respectful distance, and said, "Hey, I saw you looking at that poetry book earlier. Any recommendations? I've been trying to get into it, but honestly, I have no idea where to start." She looked a little surprised at first, but then she smiled and said, "Oh, it's kind of a niche thing, but I was actually reading Mary Oliver. She's incredible if you're into nature poetry." That kicked off a whole conversation about favorite books, what got her into poetry, and how I was more of a sci-fi geek who was trying to branch out. The trick for me was keeping it casual and making it about her interests instead of just trying to impress her. I didn't say anything about her appearance or try to push the conversation in a flirty direction right away. I was genuinely curious, and I think she could tell that. It wasn't some act, it was just two people talking about books in a place where people talk about books. After about 10 minutes, she grabbed her coffee and said she had to get back to reading, so I took that as my cue to wrap things up. I said, "Thanks for the recommendation. I'll definitely check it out. Maybe I'll run into you here again sometime." I wasn't expecting anything beyond that, but she actually paused and said, "Yeah, that'd be nice. Or you could just text me if you end up reading it." Then she handed me a scrap of paper with her number on it. I couldn't believe how smoothly it had gone, but I think the key was that I approached it without any heavy expectations. I didn't go in thinking, I need to get her number. I just thought, hey, here's a chance to talk about something she's clearly passionate about. And if she wasn't into the conversation, no big deal. I could have just left her to her poetry and continued with my day. The real lesson for me was that when you take the pressure off yourself to get something out of the interaction, it's a lot easier to relax and just enjoy talking to someone new. Plus, focusing on a shared interest, something that's right there in front of both of you, makes it feel less like you're making a move and more like you're having a genuine conversation. So, my advice is to keep it simple and focused on the moment. Don't worry about whether it'll turn into a date or if you'll get her number. Just think about what you might have in common. If she's open to talking, great. If not, just smile, wish her a good day, and move on. It's a lot less stressful for both sides, and you might even end up with a good book recommendation out of it. A few years ago, I took a job doing volunteer work in a remote area of Costa Rica. It was a little village surrounded by rainforest, miles away from any major town. The kind of place where cell service was a luxury, and the only connection to the outside world was a dusty road that flooded out during the rainy season. It was paradise in a lot of ways, but it had its fair share of dangers too, ones you wouldn't necessarily think about until it was too late. I worked with a small team helping to build a community center, and most of the time, we spent our days hauling supplies, mixing concrete, and sweating through our shirts under the blazing sun. But in the evenings, after the sun dipped behind the canopy, the place took on a different vibe. That's when the jungle really came alive, and you realized just how close you were to the wild. One night, a local family invited me and a couple of other volunteers over for dinner. Their house was a simple wooden structure, raised up on stilts to keep out the floodwaters. After we ate, we sat outside on their porch, drinking coffee and listening to the hum of insects. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, and everything around us was pitch black except for the lantern hanging from the roof beam. At some point, one of the kids, this little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, ran down the stairs to chase after a frog he'd seen hopping through the mud. He was barefoot, like most of the kids out there, and I remember his mother calling out after him to come back, but she wasn't really worried. It was a common sight, kids running off into the night, used to the rhythms of the place. Not even 2 minutes later, we heard a high-pitched scream, one of those sounds that sends a jolt through your entire body, like a shock of electricity. The mother leapt to her feet, dropping her coffee cup as she bolted down the stairs, the rest of us right behind her. In the darkness, the only light came from our phones as we scrambled to find the kid. We found him kneeling in the mud, clutching his leg, tears streaming down his face. His mother's breath caught in her throat when she saw what he was holding, a tiny, bright yellow frog, still clutched in his small hands. She smacked it out of his grip, sending it flying into the darkness, and I'll never forget the fear in her voice as she told us to get back now. I didn't understand at first. It was just a little frog. How dangerous could it be? But one of the other volunteers, who had been in the area longer than I had, grabbed my arm and whispered, "That's a golden dart frog. He's got about 5 minutes before it gets really bad. We carried the kid up to the house, his mother cradling him as she yelled for his older brother to fetch a neighbor who had a motorbike. I watched, helpless, as the kid's face twisted in pain, his breaths coming faster and faster. His leg was swelling up, the skin turning an angry red where the frog's poison had seeped in. I could hear the rasping sound as his breathing turned labored, each gasp more frantic than the last. The neighbor arrived a few minutes later, and they wrapped the boy in a blanket and strapped him to the back of the motorbike. They took off down the muddy road, heading for the nearest clinic over an hour away, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. I just stood there on the porch, shaking, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. I'd seen the frog before. Those golden darts are beautiful, about the size of a quarter, and they have this brilliant yellow color that almost seems to glow. But what I hadn't realized was that their skin secretes a powerful toxin, one of the deadliest in the world. Locals knew to leave them alone, but the kid had grown up around them and never thought twice about catching one. A single touch could deliver enough poison to kill a human if it got into the bloodstream, shutting down the muscles and the heart in minutes. We heard later that the kid made it barely. The doctor at the clinic managed to stabilize him, but he was in bad shape for a while. He couldn't walk for weeks, and his leg remained swollen and painful long after the poison had worn off. His mother came by the next morning to thank us, but she was shaking, her face pale, as she kept repeating how close it had been, how they'd almost lost him. I tried to smile, but all I could think about was how something so small could carry so much death inside it, hidden beneath that bright, innocent-looking skin. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about how close we'd come to a different ending. Every time I walked through the forest, I found myself watching the ground, half expecting another flash of yellow in the underbrush. It was like the whole jungle had shifted for me. No longer just a place of beauty, but somewhere filled with hidden dangers, things that could kill you before you even realized you were in trouble. I started asking questions, learning more about the creatures that lived around us. There were snakes that could paralyze you with a bite, spiders whose venom could cause your flesh to rot, even plants that looked harmless but would leave blisters if you brushed against them. It felt like the entire forest was a reminder that life could be taken away in a heartbeat by creatures you'd never expect. But the golden dart frog stuck with me the most. I learned that indigenous people in the area used to use the frog's toxin to coat the tips of their blow darts for hunting. That's where the name came from. But even they treated the frogs with a kind of reverence, knowing that to touch one directly was to court death. When I finally finished my time in Costa Rica and came back home, I had a hard time adjusting. I'd walk through parks or take hikes, but I couldn't shake the habit of scanning the ground, half expecting something lethal to jump out at me. My friends joked that I'd gotten paranoid, but they hadn't seen what I'd seen, hadn't felt that cold panic in the pit of their stomachs when a life hangs in the balance over something so small, so deceptively innocent. And it wasn't just the jungle. It made me realize how many little things in life can turn deadly without warning. A slip in the shower, a bad turn on the road, a decision to reach out and touch something you don't understand. We live our lives surrounded by hidden dangers, but most of the time we forget they're even there until the moment they remind us. I keep a small photograph on my desk now, one I took in Costa Rica of a golden dart frog resting on a leaf. Most people who see it comment on how beautiful it is, how vibrant its colors are. They never understand why I shudder when I look at it, why I tell them not to reach out and touch it, even though it's just a picture. I don't tell them the whole story anymore. I just say that some things are better left alone. Okay, here's one I've kept under wraps for a while. I've been secretly learning how to play the piano. Now, that probably doesn't sound like a big deal, but let me give you some context. My partner is a classically trained pianist, and she's good. Like, could play at her recital good. She's been playing since she was a kid, and music is pretty much in her DNA. Me? I can barely keep a beat when I clap along to songs on the radio. But ever since we moved in together, there's this one song she plays all the time, Clair de Lune by Debussy. It's her favorite. She plays it when she's had a rough day, when she's missing her family, or when she just wants to unwind. I'll be sitting in the other room, listening to her play, and there's this look she gets on her face when she's lost in the music, like everything else in the world has faded away for a little while. It's my favorite version of her, One evening, she caught me listening from the doorway, and she gave me this little smile like, "Come sit with me." She asked if I wanted to try playing something, but I was too embarrassed. I just shrugged and said, "Nah, I'm all thumbs." And she laughed it off, probably thinking I wasn't interested. But the truth is, I really wanted to join her. I just didn't want to make a fool of myself. So I got this idea in my head. What if just once I could play something for her? Nothing fancy, just enough to show her that I've been listening, that I want to share that part of her world, even if it's way outside my comfort zone. So, a few months ago, I downloaded this piano app and started learning in secret. I practiced on this old keyboard I bought off Craigslist, which I hid in the back of the closet under a pile of old blankets. I'd pull it out when she wasn't home, trying to teach myself the basics, scales, chords, all the stuff that I figured would help me not sound like a complete disaster. At first, it was rough. I could barely get through "Mary Had a Little Lamb" without messing up, and don't even get me started on trying to read sheet music. It was like staring at an alien language. But I kept at it, practicing whenever I could, early mornings before she woke up, or late at night after she'd gone to bed. There were times when I'd get frustrated and think about giving up, but then I'd hear her playing in the other room, and it would remind me why I started in the first place. Eventually, I got brave enough to tackle her favorite, Claire de Lune. I won't lie, I've butchered it more times than I can count, but I learned it slowly, painstakingly, one note at a time. I even recorded myself playing on my phone and listened back, cringing at every mistake, but also feeling kind of proud of the progress. I'm nowhere near her level, but there's this one part of the piece that I can finally get through without hesitating, and every time I hit those notes, I get this little rush of excitement. The plan is to play it for her on our anniversary, which is coming up in a few weeks. I'm not expecting to blow her away or anything, but I just want to see the look on her face when she realizes that I learned her song. I've even been practicing this little speech in my head about how much I admire her passion for music, how I wanted to do this because it's something that means so much to her. I've thought about the moment so many times that I've probably memorized it more than the song itself. It's funny though, in all my practice, I've realized that I actually enjoy playing. It's become this way for me to unwind too. There's something meditative about trying to get your fingers to move in just the right way, to feel the music flow through you. It makes me understand her in a way I didn't before, like I get why she's always drawn to the piano when she's feeling a certain way. The hardest part has been keeping it all hidden from her. There have been a few close calls, like the time she nearly found my secret keyboard stash when she was looking for a spare blanket. I had to think fast and joke that I was reorganizing the closet, and she just rolled her eyes and said I'd better not make a mess. Another time, she heard a note or two when I accidentally bumped the keys while trying to hide the keyboard. She called out from the other room, "Is that a piano?" And I had to cover it up by pretending I'd stepped on one of her music boxes. But I'm almost ready now. I've got the whole thing planned out. Candlelit dinner, her favorite dessert, and then I'll ask her to sit with me at the piano. I'll probably be sweating bullets, but I hope I can get through the song without messing up too much. I just want to give her that one moment where she sees that I've been paying attention, that I care enough to try, even if I'm a little clumsy with the keys. I'm nervous as hell, but I can't wait to see her reaction. I hope she'll be able to hear how much I love her in every note. And who knows, maybe we'll end up playing duets together someday, her guiding me through all the tricky parts with that patient smile she has. But for now, I'm just hoping I don't butcher the ending too badly. Wish me luck. I'm gonna need it. Back when I was fresh out of high school, I spent a summer working at a small amusement park just outside of town. It wasn't one of those huge parks with roller coasters that scrape the sky. It was more like a collection of rides that had seen better days, the kind of place families went for a cheap day out. I got a job as a ride operator, running one of those spinning rides where you sit in a metal cage that flips around while the whole platform rotates. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid, and it was a good way to save up some cash before college. Most days were pretty routine. Checking seat belts, making sure no one was too short to ride, hitting the start button, then watching as people screamed and laughed while the ride spun them around. We had safety training, of course, but after a few weeks, it all started to feel like second nature. You get a feel for when the machinery was acting a little off or when a latch needed some extra attention. The park manager would always tell us, "Don't get too comfortable around these rides. They might look fun, but they'll kill you if you don't respect them." I always thought he was just trying to scare us. One evening, Toward the end of the summer, I was working the late shift when something happened that made me realize just how right he was. It was a quiet night, just a few families and some teenagers looking for a thrill. The sun had already set, and the lights of the rides cast this warm glow over everything, making the shadows dance on the pavement. I remember feeling a little sleepy, zoning out as I watched the spinning lights, listening to the hum of the machinery. I had just started another round of the ride when I heard a strange grinding sound, low and metallic, like gears straining against each other. I glanced over at the control panel, expecting to see a warning light or something, but everything looked fine. Still, the sound put me on edge, and I kept my hand hovering over the stop button just in case. The ride kept spinning, the cages flipping upside down, but the grinding noise grew louder, more uneven. I felt this sinking feeling in my stomach, like something was about to go terribly wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw one of the cages starting to shake violently, jerking back and forth against the motion of the ride. Before I could process what was happening, the latch holding that cage's door snapped. There was a loud crack, like a firecracker going off, and the door flew open, banging against the side of the cage as it spun around. The two teenage girls inside were screaming, their hands scrambling to hold onto the metal bars as they dangled out of the opening, their feet flailing above the platform. My heart stopped, and I hit the emergency stop button so hard my hand bruised. The whole ride lurched to a halt, the spinning slowing in jerky, uneven movements. But the momentum had already thrown the loose cage off balance, and it kept rocking back and forth, the girls slipping further out with each swing. I don't know how I moved so fast, but suddenly I was there, underneath the cage, reaching up to try and push them back in. The whole ride was groaning, the metal creaking like it was about to snap, and I could see one of the bolts on the cage starting to give way. One of the girls managed to hook her arm around the bar, but the other was slipping, her face white with terror. I grabbed her wrist, bracing my feet against the platform. And I remember thinking, if she falls, I won't be able to catch her. Somehow, I managed to hold on long enough for a couple of my co-workers to get there, pulling the girls to safety while I kept the cage steady. When it was finally over, I collapsed against the side of the ride, my hands trembling so badly I couldn't unclench them from the metal. The girls were crying, clutching each other, their faces wet with tears. They kept thanking me, but I could barely hear them over the roaring in my ears, my mind replaying the sight of that open door swinging back and forth. The park manager came over, his face ashen, and shut down the ride for the night. He kept mumbling about how the maintenance team would be in trouble, how he'd personally inspected the ride that morning, and everything had been fine. But I couldn't stop thinking about how close we'd come to a real tragedy, how just a few seconds could have meant the difference between saving those girls and watching them fall. Later that night, after the paramedics checked the girls out and everyone had gone home, the manager called me into his office. He poured me a cup of coffee, and we sat there in silence for a long time. Finally, he said, "You did get out there. But remember, never trust the machinery more than you trust your gut. It'll fail you faster than you think." I thought about that a lot in the weeks that followed. I kept replaying those moments in my head, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't reacted as quickly as I did, if I'd ignored that strange grinding sound. I couldn't help but think of how fragile everything really is, how a simple latch, a single bolt, can mean the difference between a normal night and disaster. I didn't last much longer at that job. Even after the ride was repaired and deemed safe again, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread whenever I stepped into the operator's booth, couldn't ignore the memories of those screams and the sight of the cage swinging open. I ended up quitting a few weeks before the season ended, telling myself it was time to focus on school. But I carried that lesson with me, about how easy it is to take things for granted, to forget that even the most familiar places can hide dangers beneath the surface. Now, whenever I go to an amusement park or even a local carnival, I can't help but watch the rides with a new kind of wariness, listening for those little sounds that most people ignore. I tell people sometimes about that summer, about how a tiny piece of metal nearly led to disaster, but I don't think they really get it. They laugh it off, say, well, I guess that's why they call it a thrill ride, right? But they weren't there. They didn't see how quickly everything went wrong, how a moment of carelessness can be all it takes for something that's supposed to be fun to turn deadly. And every time I hear about an amusement park accident on the news, I think back to those girls, to the way their faces looked as they clung to those bars, and I shiver. It's a reminder that safety isn't a given, that sometimes the smallest crack in the system can bring everything crashing down. And it's a lesson I'll never forget, because I know how close I came to being the one standing there, helpless, watching a tragedy unfold right before my eyes. Now, even years later, I can't walk past a roller coaster or a Ferris wheel without that feeling creeping up my spine, that sense that beneath the lights and the laughter, there's a danger lurking, waiting for a moment of weakness to show its teeth. And I remember the manager's words, echoing in my mind, "Never trust the machinery more than you trust your gut." This one still makes me shiver whenever I think about it. I used to work at a marina, doing maintenance and helping people dock their boats during the summer season. It was a beautiful place. Sparkling blue water, the smell of salt in the air, seagulls calling overhead. I loved the job, but it came with risks. We dealt with ropes under tension, electrical work near water, and of course, the boats themselves. But the scariest moment I ever had wasn't because of any of those things. It was because of something I'd never even considered dangerous before. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, and the marina was packed. People were coming in from a day of fishing. Families were docking their sailboats, and the place was buzzing with the usual summer energy. I was helping one of our regulars tie up his boat, a big old fishing trawler he'd had for decades. As I was looping a thick mooring line around the cleat on the dock, he called out to me, "Hey, watch out for that line, it's under tension." I glanced back at the rope, which looked like it always did, fraying in a few places, but solid enough. He kept his boat in good shape, or so I thought, so I figured he was just being cautious. I gave him a thumbs up and started tightening the line, using the winch to get it taut. But as I cranked, I could feel the rope shuddering, the tension building in a way that made me uneasy. I should have trusted my gut, but I just wanted to get the job done, and so I kept going. Then, out of nowhere, there was a loud crack like a gunshot. The mooring line snapped in half, and everything seemed to slow down. I remember seeing the rope whip through the air, a blur of frayed strands and snapping fibers. It caught me across the side, right below my ribs, and the force knocked me clean off my feet, sending me sprawling onto the dock. I didn't even realize what had happened at first. There was this blinding pain, sharp and hot, and then I was gasping for air, clutching at my side. My vision went blurry, and all I could hear was the sound of my own ragged breathing mixed with the distant cries of the seagulls. I tried to sit up, but it felt like my ribs were on fire, like something had shattered inside of me. I could taste blood on my lips, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is how I die. Luckily, the boat owner saw what happened and ran over, shouting for help. One of my coworkers called 911, and within minutes, there were people all around me telling me to stay still, to keep breathing. But it was hard. Every breath felt like a knife going deeper into my chest. I was terrified that the rope had punctured something vital, that I was bleeding out internally right there on the sun-bleached boards of the dock. The paramedics arrived and lifted me onto a stretcher, securing my neck just in case, and I remember drifting in and out of consciousness on the way to the hospital. My mind kept replaying that moment, the way the rope snapped and the sound it made as it whipped through the air. I kept thinking about how close it had come to hitting me in the neck or the head, how easily it could have killed me in a heartbeat. At the hospital, they found that I had a couple of broken ribs and some internal bruising, but thankfully no punctured lungs or organs. They said I was lucky. If the line had hit me just a few inches higher, it would have likely caused a fatal injury. I stayed in the hospital for a few days, doped up on painkillers, but even with the meds, every breath was a reminder of how close I'd come to dying. After I was released, I spent a few weeks recovering at home, staring out the window at the lake, replaying that moment over and over again. I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have known better, should have realized how dangerous a tension line could be. I'd worked with them every day, watched them pull boats against the current, seen the strain they could hold. But I'd never really understood just how lethal that force could be until I felt it lash out at me. When I finally went back to work, I was a different person. I became obsessive about safety, double-checking every line and inspecting every rope for signs of wear. I'd stop anyone who tried to tighten a line too far, and I made sure the other employees knew just how dangerous it could be. Some of the old-timers rolled their eyes, said I was being dramatic, but I didn't care. I knew what I'd felt that day, the power in that snap, and I wasn't going to let anyone else make the same mistake. And it's not just ropes. Anything under tension can be dangerous. I remember once seeing a story about a guy who was working on a boat's anchor chain when a link snapped, hitting him in the head. He was dead before he hit the ground. It made my blood run cold, thinking about how close I'd come to being just another statistic, just another freak accident in a job that most people think is all sunshine and easy living. The incident also changed the way I think about life in general. How fragile we really are, how quickly things can go from normal to life-threatening. I still have a scar along my side where the rope caught me, a jagged reminder that danger doesn't always come from where you expect it. It's a conversation starter sometimes, but most people don't really understand what it means. They see it as just another story, something that happened once and then was over. But to me, it's a reminder that we're always closer to the edge than we think. Even now, years later, I still feel a jolt of anxiety whenever I hear a rope straining under tension, that creaking sound it makes just before it snaps. It's like a warning bell in my brain, telling me to take a step back, to respect the power that's hidden in something so seemingly harmless. And every time I hear about someone getting injured by a snapped line or a broken cable, I think about that day on the dock and wonder if they had a chance to realize what was happening before it was too late. So, if you're ever around a boat, a crane, or even just a rusty old garage door, remember this. Anything under tension is not to be taken lightly. It's a force that can turn on you in an instant, faster than you can react. And when it does, it's like facing a force of nature, something that doesn't care about how experienced you are or how careful you think you're being. It just strikes, and you're left dealing with the consequences. If you're lucky enough to survive, you won't forget it anytime soon. Because sometimes it's not the waves or the wind or the currents that get you. Sometimes it's the things you thought you understood, the ropes you've tied 1,000 times, the cables you've tightened without a second thought. And all it takes is 1 second, one snap, to remind you just how fragile life really is. I was about 8 years old when my dad took me fishing at this quiet little river we knew. It wasn't marked on any maps, just one of those hidden spots you hear about through friends of friends. You had to drive for miles down an unpaved road, parked by an ancient oak tree with roots that looked like giant hands gripping the earth, and then hike down a narrow trail. It was a place where time seemed to stand still. The only sounds were the river murmuring over stones, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the occasional splash of a fish. That day had been perfect. We caught a few trout, and I remember the sun sinking low in the sky, turning everything golden and soft. My dad was showing me how to tie a new knot when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence, staring out across the river, his face going pale. I followed his gaze, but I couldn't see anything beyond the shadows creeping in from the trees. He put a finger to his lips, a gesture that immediately turned my stomach into a knot of fear, even though I didn't know why. "Pack up," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. "We're leaving. Now." I opened my mouth to ask why, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He had this intensity, the kind I'd only seen once before, when a black bear wandered too close to our campsite a few summers back. But there were no bears here. No sound of snapping twigs or growls in the underbrush. Just the growing hum of crickets and the first hoot of an owl as the sun dipped lower. My dad started moving fast, gathering up the fishing poles, our cooler, the old plaid blanket we'd been sitting on. I helped as best as I could, fumbling with the tackle box. My hands felt clumsy, and my heart was racing, thudding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The whole time, my dad kept glancing across the river like he was expecting something, or someone to come out of the trees. As we hurried up the path toward the car, I risked a glance back over my shoulder. And that's when I saw him, a figure standing just outside the tree line on the other side of the river. He was tall, almost unnaturally thin, dressed in dark clothing that made him blend into the shadows. It took me a second to realize he was watching us. His face was hidden under a wide-brimmed hat, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and calculating. My skin prickled all over. I tugged on my dad's sleeve, whispering, "Dad, there's a man. Don't look back," he snapped, his voice tighter than I'd ever heard it. "Just keep walking." We reached the old oak, and he practically shoved me into the passenger seat of our beat-up truck. I remember the metallic taste of fear on my tongue as he started the engine and pulled out onto the dirt road, so fast the tires spit up rocks. He kept checking the rearview mirror, his hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I twisted around in my seat, craning my neck to see if the man was following us. But there was nothing, just the trees rushing past, darkening as night closed in. We didn't speak the whole drive home. My dad's jaw was clenched, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, but I could see how he kept darting glances to the mirrors, like he couldn't shake the feeling we were being followed. When we finally got home, he locked the doors and windows, something he never bothered with before, not in our sleepy little town where everyone knew each other. I tried to ask him what had happened, but he just shook his head, muttering, "You don't need to know. Just forget about it." For a while I tried, but then a few days later, I overheard him talking to our neighbor, Mr. Jensen, while I pretended to be engrossed in my comic book on the porch. They spoke in hushed tones, but the words drifted over, something about a strange man in the woods and a rifle. My dad's voice wavered when he described the figure he'd seen, lurking by the riverbank, shifting between the trees. He said it looked like the guy had been holding something long, maybe a hunting rifle, cradled in his arms. Jensen asked if he'd called the sheriff, but my dad just laughed, this bitter, uneasy sound. What's the sheriff gonna do? Chase ghosts. He was gone by the time we left, anyway. Probably just some drifter passing through. But, I don't know, Mike. It didn't feel right. Those words stuck with me. I started having nightmares about the man in the woods, picturing him creeping closer in the dark, his face hidden under that shadowy hat, his hands gripping the rifle. I imagined what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did, if we'd stayed just a little longer by the riverbank. A few weeks later, we heard that a couple of hikers had found an old campsite on the far side of the river. They said it looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry, food still on the fire, and a tattered sleeping bag left behind. They also found shell casings scattered in the dirt nearby, too fresh to be from hunting season. The local rumor mill went wild. Everything from a hermit living out in the woods to a fugitive hiding from the law. My dad never talked about it again, but he did pull me aside one night before bed, put a hand on my shoulder and said, "You did good, keeping quiet back there. Sometimes you just gotta trust your gut." I nodded, but I knew I'd never forget the look on his face that day by the river. The look of a man who had stared into something dark and unknown and didn't want to know what lay beyond. And to this day, every time I hear the rustling of leaves in the woods or see a shadow where it shouldn't be, I get that same tight, breathless feeling in my chest. It's like a part of me is always standing on that riverbank, caught between the fading light and whatever waited in those trees. And sometimes, in my dreams, I see that shadowy figure again, standing just beyond the edge of my vision. Only now he's closer, always a little closer. Alright, here's a secret I've kept for a long time. I've been secretly saving money for us to take a trip to Japan, and I haven't told her a single thing. It's been almost 2 years now, and I'm finally getting close to pulling it off. She's always talked about wanting to go, ever since we first started dating. Her favorite movies are Studio Ghibli. She dreams of seeing cherry blossoms in person, and she's obsessed with ramen. So, after hearing her go on and on about it, I decided I'd save up enough for us to go on a full 2-week adventure without her having to worry about a single thing. The problem? She's incredibly practical and loves to plan everything to a T. If she even suspected that I was stashing away money for a surprise trip, she'd probably veto the whole thing, saying we should put it toward our mortgage or rainy day fund instead. I totally get where she's coming from, but I also know how much she's always wanted to go, so I kept it a secret and got creative with my saving. It started small. I take my lunch to work instead of ordering out, put the difference in a separate account. I sold some old vinyls I didn't listen to anymore and squirreled away that money too. When my buddies would invite me to join them for drinks after work, I'd make an excuse and instead put what I would have spent into the fund. I even started a little side hustle, fixing up old electronics and flipping them online just to add a little more to the pot. Honestly, I didn't think I'd be able to save much at first. The first few months, It felt like every time I managed to put a few bucks aside, something would come up, a car repair, a birthday gift, whatever. But I kept at it, little by little, and eventually the numbers in that account started to add up. There were nights when she'd be watching TV, completely unaware, while I was secretly Googling best things to do in Kyoto or how to book a hot spring ryokan. One time I almost got caught. I was watching a video on hidden gems in Tokyo when she walked into the room. I panicked and slammed my laptop shut like a teenager caught looking at something he shouldn't. She gave me this suspicious look and asked what I was doing. I mumbled some excuse about checking out a new gadget for work, and she just shrugged and walked away, but my heart was pounding like crazy. I had to laugh at myself afterward, planning a surprise trip and acting like I was hiding state secrets or something. The toughest part has been keeping it from her when we talk about our finances. She's really careful with money, always making sure we're saving enough for the future, and sometimes I feel a little guilty knowing I've got this whole separate plan in motion. But then I picture the moment I'll tell her, how I'll give her this little envelope with the itinerary inside, how she'll open it up and realize what I've been working toward all this time. I can already see the way her face will light up, the way she'll probably hug me too tight and squeal like she does when she's excited. She deserves it, you know? She's been through so much, and she always puts others first, never treating herself to anything big or extravagant. This trip, it's my way of saying, hey, I see everything you do, and you're worth this and more. It's cheesy, I know, but I think she'll get it. And now I'm finally close, like really close. I've got enough for the flights, hotels, and even a few splurge-worthy experiences, like a private tea ceremony and tickets to the Ghibli Museum. I've even planned for a few of those quirky capsule hotels she's always said she wanted to try. All I have to do now is book the dates, which I've timed to coincide with cherry blossom season, because she's always said she wanted to see them blooming over those traditional temples. But man, keeping this secret hasn't been easy. Sometimes when she talks about how tight things are, or how we should hold off on taking any big vacations, I have to bite my tongue and keep from blurting out, "Don't worry, I've got it covered." It's been so long that I've almost forgotten what it's like to have a normal conversation without carefully steering clear of anything that might give it away. I can't wait for the day I finally get to tell her. Just imagining her reaction keeps me going, especially on those nights when I'm tired and tempted to dip into the fun for something else. I've got a countdown going on my phone, tracking the days until I hit my savings goal, and every time I look at it, it gives me this jolt of excitement, like holy crap, it's really happening. If you see a guy in Japan next spring with a giant, goofy smile and a girl next to him who looks like she's living her dream, that'll probably be us. I just hope I can keep my mouth shut until then. This happened when I was working as an EMT in a rural part of New York. Most days were routine, picking up people with sprains, treating a few minor cuts, or driving folks to the hospital after a car accident. But there was one call that still haunts me to this day. It's a reminder that sometimes, even the most seemingly innocuous situations can turn deadly before you even realize what's happening. It was a quiet afternoon, and my partner and I were parked near a diner, grabbing a quick bite between calls. Just as I was taking my first sip of coffee, the radio crackled to life with a call about a carbon monoxide poisoning. It wasn't something we heard too often, but we both jumped into action right away, leaving our half-eaten lunches behind as we sped toward the address. It was an old house, the kind that had probably been standing for 100 years, with creaky floorboards and a furnace that looked like it was a relic from the 1950s. When we got there, the caller, a young woman in her 20s, was standing outside on the porch, pale as a sheet and shivering even though it wasn't cold out. She kept telling us that she felt dizzy, that her head was pounding, but she hadn't realized it might be carbon monoxide until she found her husband collapsed in the living room. She'd managed to drag him outside, but he wasn't moving, and she kept looking back toward the open front door like she was afraid something inside might come out after her. We immediately put oxygen masks on both of them and called for backup. While my partner stayed with the woman, I headed inside to check if anyone else was in the house. As soon as I crossed the threshold, I felt a wave of nausea and a tightness in my chest, like I was walking into a room with no air. I forced myself to stay calm, taking shallow breaths as I quickly searched the rooms. There were no kids, no pets, just a dog bowl and a couple of empty beer cans on the coffee table. But the air was thick, heavy with that invisible threat that I couldn't see but could feel pressing down on me. I stumbled back outside, my vision swimming a little from the dizziness. My partner grabbed my shoulder, pulling me further away from the house, and I ripped the mask from the unconscious man's face to put it on myself, drawing in a few deep breaths of clean oxygen. It was a harsh reminder that carbon monoxide is a silent killer. No smell, no color, just this creeping force that seeps into your lungs and takes away your ability to think straight. It wasn't long before the fire department arrived, carrying detectors that confirmed what we already knew: lethal levels of carbon monoxide inside the house. I'd read about carbon monoxide in training, of course, knew that it was dangerous, but this was the first time I'd really felt it. How it messes with your mind, making your thoughts go foggy, tricking you into thinking you're just tired when in reality, your organs are slowly being starved of oxygen. And the scariest part? The young woman had said they'd both felt off for a couple of days, but assumed it was just the flu. As the firefighters ventilated the house, I watched the woman clutching her husband's hand, her face twisted with guilt and terror. She kept saying, "I should have known. I should have called sooner," over and over like a mantra. It hit me then how easily this could have been a tragedy. A young couple going to bed one night, slipping into unconsciousness without ever realizing they'd never wake up. And all because of a faulty furnace, a tiny crack in an exhaust pipe that had leaked just enough poison to fill the house over time. I rode with them to the hospital, holding the woman's hand while my partner worked on her husband, giving him more oxygen and keeping a close eye on his vitals. Thankfully, they both made it, though the husband had to stay in a hyperbaric chamber for a few hours to flush out the toxins. By the time we got back to the station, I was exhausted, but I couldn't shake the thought of how close they'd come to dying without ever knowing what hit them. A few weeks later, I went back to their house, off duty, just to check in. The woman answered the door, looking a lot better, with her husband standing behind her, still a little pale but alive. They'd replaced the furnace and installed carbon monoxide detectors in every room, and they both thanked me a dozen times for helping them. But as I walked back to my car, I couldn't help but think of how many other homes might have that same silent danger lurking inside, just waiting for the right conditions to turn deadly. I started carrying a carbon monoxide detector in my EMT bag after that, and every time I responded to a call in an older house, I'd turn it on just to be safe. Some of my colleagues teased me about being paranoid, but I didn't care. I'd seen firsthand how fast carbon monoxide could turn a regular day into a life-or-death situation, and I wasn't about to take any chances. It changed the way I looked at a lot of things, really. I started paying more attention to those little household warnings you usually ignore, checking the batteries and smoke detectors, keeping an eye on the water heater, and making sure to crack a window when running the car in the garage. It made me realize that life is a lot more fragile than we like to think, and that the things we don't see or think about are often the most dangerous. I'd tell friends and family to buy carbon monoxide detectors, even offer to install them myself if they didn't want to bother. Some of them listened, but others just shrugged it off, saying, "We've never had a problem before. Why would it start now?" And all I could do was hope they'd never have to find out the hard way. It's easy to forget that we're surrounded by things that can kill us without warning. Gases, chemicals, even the air we breathe. We get used to our homes being safe, to our routines being predictable, until something happens that shakes that illusion. And that's the scariest part about carbon monoxide. It's not like a fire where you see the flames and smell the smoke. It's a thief in the night, slipping into your lungs while you're asleep, taking away your breath before you even realize something is wrong. Whenever I think about that call, I still get chills. I see the image of that young woman standing on her porch, her husband lying pale and still beside her, and I remember how quickly everything can change. How a day that starts out normal can end with lives hanging in the balance, all because of something you can't see or smell. And every time I hear about another case on the news, I think of the hundreds of homes out there that might have a similar danger lurking inside, just waiting for its chance. Now, years later, I still have a couple of those portable detectors in my car, and every time I hear a faint beeping from one, I get this rush of adrenaline, even if it's just low battery. It's a reminder that danger doesn't always come with a warning, that sometimes the things you can't see are the ones you need to fear the most. And if sharing that story convinces even one person to take it seriously, maybe it'll make a difference. It's strange, how something so invisible can leave such a deep mark. But then, that's what makes it so terrifying, isn't it? That something you can't even see could be waiting in the air around you, ready to take everything away in just a matter of breaths. I was about 22 when I had the scariest "we need to leave now" moment of my life. I had just gotten married, and my husband was stationed at Camp Pendleton as a Marine. We were living in a tiny house in Fallbrook, California, a sleepy little town surrounded by hills and orange groves. It was the kind of place where nights were dark, really dark, and you could hear the crickets singing and the coyotes howling in the distance. It wasn't unusual for us to take the long drive along Mission Road, a winding, narrow stretch that cut through a canyon to get back home. It was one of those roads where cell service came and went, and the only light came from your own headlights slicing through the darkness. One night, around 11 p.m., I was driving home from visiting my family a few towns south. It was foggy, the kind of thick mist that curls around everything and makes the world feel smaller, more isolated. I remember feeling a little uneasy, but I kept telling myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me. As I slowed down for one of the sharper bends in the road, the uneasy feeling turned into something sharper, like a cold shiver that started at the back of my neck and slid all the way down my spine. I never felt anything like it before, and I couldn't explain why my hands suddenly felt clammy on the steering wheel. That's when I saw her, a young woman, barely more than a girl, suddenly appearing out of the mist on the side of the road. She was waving her arms, her eyes wide and frantic as they caught the beam of my headlights. She was wearing jeans and a hoodie that looked a little too thin for the chilly night air. I remember her face clearly. It was pale, almost ghostly in the dim light, with strands of dark hair plastered to her cheeks. For a split second, I thought about stopping. She looked like she was in trouble, like she desperately needed help. But then, something inside me snapped. My instincts were screaming at me not to stop. I had this overwhelming sense that if I pulled over, if I even slowed down too much, something terrible would happen. I swerved slightly to the right to avoid hitting her, but kept going, my foot pressing down on the gas harder than before. I remember glancing in my rearview mirror as I drove past her, but she was already fading back into the fog. I called 911 as soon as I hit a stretch of road where I got a few bars of service. My voice shook as I described the girl and the spot where I'd seen her. The dispatcher asked if I could stay nearby until a patrol car arrived, but I was already miles down the road, heart pounding like I'd run a marathon. I told them I couldn't stop, that I felt too scared, and the dispatcher, bless her, told me I did the right thing by calling. The next morning, I woke up still shaken and checked the local news online, half expecting to find some tragic story about a missing girl. But there was nothing. No reports, no follow-ups. A week passed, and I started to think maybe it had all been in my head, just a trick of the fog and the late hour. But a part of me couldn't let it go. I kept searching the news, hoping I'd find some explanation. Then, 2 weeks later, there was a small story buried deep in the local section. A carjacking gone wrong on Mission Road. A couple had stopped for a young woman who flagged them down, claiming her car had broken down. The moment they pulled over, 2 men came out from behind the trees and dragged the driver out of the car, beating him badly before speeding off with the vehicle. The woman, it turned out, had been part of the setup. The police found her a few days later, along with one of the guys she'd been working with, but the second guy had disappeared. My stomach turned as I read the article. My hands started shaking, and I had to put my phone down for a minute just to catch my breath. All I could think about was how easily that could have been me, how close I'd come to being caught in whatever trap they'd set up. That strange, inexplicable feeling in the pit of my stomach had saved me from stopping for her. If I'd ignored it, I might have been the one lying in a hospital bed. Or worse, I couldn't shake the thought of the girl's face. The way she'd looked so desperate, like she was genuinely in need. The idea that someone could fake that so convincingly disturbed me in a way that I couldn't quite put into words. It made me question everything I thought I knew about reading people, about trusting my instincts. I started carrying pepper spray in my purse after that and made sure to tell my husband what had happened. He was quiet for a long time, just holding my hand while I tried to keep my voice steady. I think he realized before I did just how deeply it had shaken me. After that, he insisted on driving with me whenever I had to go anywhere after dark, even if it meant waiting up late for me to get home. Months later, when the police finally caught the second guy hiding out in a rundown trailer park, I saw his mugshot on the evening news. He had this smirk on his face, like the whole thing was a joke. But I couldn't look away from his eyes, cold, calculating, like he was still sizing up his next mark. I didn't recognize him, but just knowing he'd been there that night, lurking in the fog near the place where I'd seen the girl, sent chills down my spine. It felt like I was staring into the face of a nightmare I'd barely escaped. I stopped taking Mission Road after that. I'd take the longer route, even if it meant adding an extra half hour to my drive. My friends joked that I was being paranoid, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the full story. It felt too raw, too real, like saying it out loud might somehow bring those shadows back into my life. And honestly, a part of me felt guilty, like I'd abandoned that girl, even though I knew in my head that she hadn't really needed help, that she'd been the bait in a trap meant for someone like me. Sometimes late at night, when the fog rolls in thick around our new place and I hear the distant howl of coyotes, I think back to that night. I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't listened to that voice inside, if I'd given in to the impulse to stop. I imagine myself stepping out of the car, walking toward that figure in the mist, and my blood runs cold. There's a part of me that's grateful I'll never know for sure. But there's another part, one I try to ignore, that keeps asking, what if I'd been the first person she tried that trick on? Would I have made it out? Or would I have just become another missing name on the evening news? This is probably the closest I've ever come to thinking, this is it. It was a few years back during a camping trip with some friends. We decided to hike up into this national park. One of those places that doesn't get a lot of visitors, where you can actually see the stars at night because there's no light pollution. It was beautiful, but isolated with no cell reception for miles. We set up camp near this little clearing by a river, and everything was perfect. Clear skies, a fire going, and that kind of quiet you only get when you're deep in the woods. By the time we crawled into our tents, it was pitch black, just the sound of the river and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise. At first, I thought it was one of my friends getting up, but then I realized it was coming from outside our camp. A kind of low, rhythmic breathing. I froze, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, louder this time, like something was sniffing the air. I unzipped my tent just a little, trying not to make a sound, and peered out. My heart nearly stopped when I saw what was out there, barely visible in the moonlight. A bear, massive, with its nose down, sniffing around our campsite. It must have caught a whiff of the food we'd packed away in a cooler, but there it was, only about 20 feet from where I was lying. My mind was racing, trying to remember everything I'd read about bears' safety. Don't make sudden movements, don't run, make yourself look big if it comes close. But my hands were trembling so much that I could barely keep still. I glanced over at my friends' tents, wondering if they were awake, but there was no sound from their direction. I realized I was completely alone in that moment, staring out at this animal that could tear through my tent in seconds. The bear started moving closer, and I felt this wave of terror wash over me. I thought about making a run for it, but I knew that was a terrible idea. So I just stayed there, barely breathing, praying that it wouldn't come any closer. It stopped near the cooler and started nudging it, making this low, huffing noise that sent chills down my spine. I had this terrifying image of it getting frustrated and turning its attention toward my tent instead. Time seemed to stretch out as I lay there, every second feeling like an hour. Finally, the bear lost interest and lumbered off into the woods, its shadow disappearing among the trees. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever, listening to the sound of its footsteps fading away. Eventually, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just sat there in the dark, clutching my pocket knife, useless against something like that, and waiting for dawn. The next morning, my friends came out of their tents, talking about how they'd slept like rocks. When I told them what had happened, they thought I was exaggerating until we found the paw prints near the cooler, deep marks in the dirt. We packed up pretty quickly after that, and I couldn't shake the feeling of relief that washed over me when we finally got back to the car, putting miles between us and that campsite. To this day, the sound of heavy breathing in the dark gives me chills. I still love camping, but I always make sure we pick spots with bear boxes and a lot more people around. Because out there, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but a thin layer of nylon between me and that bear, I realized just how small and vulnerable we are in the face of nature. Alright, here's how I learned to approach women without being that awkward guy. A few years ago, I was at this outdoor concert. One of those summer events where the whole park is packed with people, music is blasting, and everyone's just having a good time. I was there with some friends, and I spotted this woman dancing with her group, just lost in the music. She looked like she was having a blast, but I knew better than to interrupt someone in the middle of their dance circle. I decided to wait until the band wrapped up their set, and everyone was milling around the drink stands. Sure enough, she ended up by herself at one of the stands, waiting for her turn. I grabbed my courage, walked up, and said, "That band is amazing live, right? Have you seen them before?" She looked over, a little surprised, but she nodded and smiled. "Yeah, I've seen them a few times. They always put on a great show." I just kept it simple, chatting about the music, how great the energy was, and even joking about how we both probably lost our voices by the end of the night. It felt like a normal conversation, like something I'd say to anyone. The trickiest part was knowing when to back off. At one point, she turned slightly like she was looking back for a friend, so I took the hint and said, "Hey, it was nice talking to you. Hope you enjoy the rest of the concert." I started to walk away, and to my surprise, she actually called out after me. "Wait, what's your name?" she asked with this smile. I ended up giving her my number, and we texted a few times after that. What I've learned is that the key isn't some magic pickup line. It's understanding when to approach and when to back off. It's about reading the situation and the person. If someone's in the middle of dancing with their friends or wearing headphones, that's probably not the best time. But if they're standing by themselves, maybe looking around, it's a better shot. And here's the thing, I didn't go into it expecting anything. I just thought, hey, this is a cool moment, let's see where it goes. I was ready to walk away if she didn't seem interested, but because I wasn't pressuring her, it actually made things easier for both of us. It turned into a genuine interaction instead of one of those awkward encounters where you feel like you're trying too hard. So my advice? Find the right moment, keep it casual, and be okay with walking away if she's not feeling it. It's way better than forcing a conversation where one doesn't fit. And honestly, you'll end up feeling a lot better about yourself, too, knowing you didn't cross any boundaries or make someone uncomfortable. I used to work as a line cook at a restaurant, one of those fast-paced places where the kitchen is always hot, loud, and a little bit chaotic. It was the kind of job where you learn to move quickly, balancing pans on the edge of burners, juggling sharp knives, and shouting orders over the sizzle of oil. After a few months, it became almost like a dance. Every step, every flip of the spatula felt automatic. But there was one night that taught me just how dangerous that rhythm could be when things go wrong. It was a Friday night, and the restaurant was packed. The kind of crowd that made the air feel heavy with heat and noise. I remember moving through the kitchen like I was on autopilot, dodging past the servers as they slid through with plates, grabbing orders off the pass. My hands were covered in cuts and burns from the week, but that's just part of the job. I was at the fry station, dropping baskets of wings into boiling oil while my coworker Jake handled the grill beside me. We were both sweating through our shirts, the heat from the fryers making the kitchen feel like a sauna. At some point, one of the fry baskets jammed, so I reached over to unhook it, gritting my teeth against the sting as a bit of hot oil splashed onto my wrist. Just another burn, no big deal. But then I heard it, a soft hissing noise like something was escaping under pressure. I glanced down and saw a thin, dark line snaking along the side of one of the big industrial fryers. A crack. My stomach dropped as I realized that the oil was leaking out, dripping down the side in slow, steady drops. And I knew what that meant. If the oil hit the open flame under the fryer, the whole thing could blow up. I shouted for Jake to kill the burners, but as he turned, the fryer gave a shudder, like something inside had shifted. I barely had time to react before there was a loud humph, and a wall of flames shot up the side of the fryer, lighting up the whole kitchen in a flash of orange. The heat hit me like a wave, hot enough to sear the hairs off my arms, and I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. Everyone in the kitchen froze, and for a second, there was this horrible moment of silence as the flames licked up toward the ceiling, feeding on the oil. Then chaos broke loose. Someone shouted for a fire extinguisher, but I could see the fire spreading, crawling across the oil that had spilled onto the floor, turning the stainless steel appliances into glowing, twisted shapes. I could feel the panic clawing up my throat as I grabbed the nearest extinguisher, trying to aim the stream at the base of the flames like they taught us in training. But the fire was too hot, too fast. Every time I managed to knock down one patch of flames, another would spring up somewhere else, the oil bubbling and spitting like a living thing. Jake tried to help, but I saw him slip on the oil-slick floor, landing hard on his back, and I knew we were in trouble. My mind was racing, trying to remember what you're supposed to do in a grease fire. Don't use water, keep the extinguisher low, but it was like the heat had scrambled my thoughts. I felt sweat pouring down my face, mixing with the sting of burns on my arms. But I kept spraying, kept fighting to keep the flames from spreading to the pantry where the dry ingredients were stacked like tinder. One of the servers ran in, shouting that the fire department was on the way, but I couldn't focus on anything except the roar of the flames, the way they crackled and surged like a living creature. I'd never seen anything like it. How quickly the fire moved, how it turned a normal Friday night into a nightmare in seconds. It was like the heat was sucking the air out of my lungs, making it hard to breathe, and I started to feel dizzy, like I was going to pass out right there in the middle of the kitchen. By the time the firefighters arrived, dragging in their hoses, the flames had already burned through part of the ceiling tiles, and the smoke was thick and choking, turning the air into a toxic cloud. They pulled me and Jake outside, and we sat on the curb in the alley, coughing up smoke, my hands still trembling from adrenaline. They managed to put the fire out before it consumed the whole building, but the damage was bad enough that the restaurant had to shut down for weeks. The kitchen was a wreck, burnt pans and melted plastic everywhere. The air still thick with the bitter smell of charred grease. As I walked through it later, trying to salvage some of my stuff, I kept thinking about how close we'd come to losing everything, to having that fire spread to the dining room where the customers had been sitting just a few feet away. That night taught me a respect for fire that I never had before. I'd always thought of it as just part of the job, something you dealt with when a burger got a little too charred or when a pan caught flame. But the truth is, in a place like that kitchen, fire is always lurking, waiting for the right moment to turn on you. It doesn't matter how many times you've handled a fryer or how careful you think you're being. If something goes wrong, it goes wrong fast. After that, I started carrying a little burn scar on my wrist as a reminder. It's a small mark, but every time I look at it, I remember the feeling of the heat on my face, the sound of the fryer cracking, and the way the flames rose up like they were trying to swallow the whole room. It's a reminder of how fragile things really are, how quickly life can change when you least expect it. When I tell people the story, they usually laugh, saying, "Well, that's why I never learned to cook," or, "Man, kitchens are dangerous places." But I don't think they really understand. They don't know how it feels to see that much fire up close, to feel the heat pressing in around you, making you wonder if you're going to get out in time. It's a kind of fear that stays with you, even after the fire's been put out. I still work in kitchens sometimes, but I never let myself forget what can happen when things go wrong. I'm the guy who double-checks the equipment, who insists on regular maintenance, who makes sure the fire extinguisher is within arm's reach. Some of my co-workers roll their eyes, but I don't care. I've seen how quickly a small problem can turn into a disaster, and I know that being prepared is the only thing that kept us from losing more than just a few pieces of equipment that night. And every time I hear about a restaurant fire on the news, I feel that old knot of fear in my stomach, that memory of standing in the middle of a burning kitchen, trying to keep it all from falling apart. I know how easy it is to take safety for granted, to think that you'll have time to react. But sometimes, all it takes is a single crack, a hiss of escaping gas or oil, and everything can change in an instant. It's a lesson I'll never forget, and one I carry with me every time I step into a kitchen. Because fire, like so many other dangers in life, doesn't care how experienced you are or how many times you've done something before. It's always waiting for that one moment of weakness, that one mistake, to remind you just how fragile you really are. This happened back when I was in college, working part-time as a lifeguard at a community pool. I'd been doing the job for a couple of summers, and by then, I felt like I'd seen it all. Kids getting a little too bold on the diving boards, teenagers trying to show off by holding their breath underwater, and the occasional panicked swimmer who needed a hand. It felt like routine work, and I'd gotten used to the rhythms of the pool. The sunbathers by the shallow end, the families playing in the kiddie area, and the serious swimmers cutting laps up and down the lanes. But there's one thing about water that I never fully appreciated until that day. It doesn't care how good you are, how strong you think you are. When it decides to pull you under, it can happen faster than you can blink. It was a hot July afternoon, the kind that brought out every kid in town looking to escape the heat. The pool was packed, and my eyes were constantly scanning the surface, watching the movements of swimmers. I remember noticing a man in his 30s who had come in alone. He looked like he'd just come off a construction site, wiry and muscular, with a deep tan and a serious expression. He swam out toward the deep end and started doing laps, powering through the water like he was trying to work off some stress. He wasn't one of the regulars, but he moved like he knew what he was doing, so I didn't pay him too much mind at first. I was focused on a couple of kids who were roughhousing near the edge of the pool when I noticed him again. He'd stopped swimming and was just treading water, but something about the way he was moving seemed off. His strokes were getting choppy, and he kept glancing around like he was trying to find the ladder, but couldn't quite focus on it. My training kicked in, and I blew my whistle, shouting, "You okay, sir?" He didn't respond, just kept floundering in place, and I saw his head dip below the water for a second longer than it should have. That's when I realized something was seriously wrong. I jumped into the water, my adrenaline spiking, and swam over to him as fast as I could. By the time I reached him, his eyes were wide with panic, and he lashed onto me with a grip so tight it felt like he was trying to pull me under with him. I twisted out of his grip and wrapped my arm around his chest like we'd been taught, kicking hard to keep us both afloat. His body was rigid, and I could feel his muscles spasming against me as he struggled to breathe. I managed to get him to the edge of the pool, where a couple of other guards helped pull him up onto the deck. I scrambled out after him, and as soon as he was flat on his back, he started coughing, choking out water as his chest heaved with ragged breaths. The whole rescue had taken maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking as I knelt beside him, trying to assess if he was okay. He just lay there, gasping for air, his face pale and his lips tinged blue. We called for an ambulance, but I kept thinking, how did this happen? He was right in front of me. How did it go so wrong so quickly? It turned out he had a cramp. Something in his leg had seized up while he was swimming, and in his panic, he'd swallowed water. His muscles had locked up, and he couldn't keep himself afloat anymore, no matter how strong he'd been when he first got in. I'd seen it before with kids, but never with an adult, and certainly not with someone who looked so physically capable. The ambulance arrived, and they took him away, wrapped up in a blanket, still shivering and coughing. I remember sitting there on the edge of the pool, staring down at the water, my mind spinning with what had just happened. One second, he'd been swimming like a pro, and the next, he was drowning in front of me, his life hanging in the balance. It hit me then how unforgiving water could be. How it didn't matter if you were a strong swimmer or not, because the moment you lose control, the water takes over. I learned later that he'd been on medication for a muscle condition, something that made him more prone to cramps. He hadn't thought it would be a problem, figured he'd just do a few laps and cool off. But he'd underestimated how quickly his body could betray him, how a tiny cramp could turn into a fight for his life. For weeks after that, I couldn't get the image of his face out of my head. The look of sheer terror as he realized he was going under. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see it, and I'd hear the sound of him choking, the desperate struggle in those last moments before I reached him. I started having nightmares about being too slow, about jumping into the water and finding it empty, or worse, finding someone lying still on the bottom of the pool beyond saving. It changed the way I approached lifeguarding. I started watching people more closely, paying attention to those little signs. Someone lingering too long at the edge, or a swimmer whose strokes were a little too frantic. I even started giving little safety talks to the kids, telling them not to swim alone, to come find us if they ever felt weird in the water. It became clear to me that drowning isn't always loud or dramatic. It can be silent, quick, the kind of thing that happens while you're looking the other way. I'm not a lifeguard anymore, but that experience stayed with me. Even now, when I go swimming with friends or visit a lake, I can't help but keep an eye on everyone around me. My friends joke about it, call me the pool police, but I don't mind. I'd rather be overly cautious than see something like that happen again. And every time I hear about someone drowning on the news, some strong swimmer who got caught in a current, or a kid who slipped under the water while their parents were distracted, it takes me back to that day. It makes me think about how quickly life can change, how a perfect summer day can turn into a nightmare in just a few breaths. And I realize that water is never as harmless as it seems. Because the truth is, it doesn't matter how much you know or how prepared you think you are. Sometimes it's the little things that catch you off guard. The way your muscle seize up at the wrong moment, or how a sudden wave can knock you off balance. It's the silence that's the most dangerous. The way drowning can happen without anyone even noticing until it's almost too late. I still go swimming, but I never forget the lesson I learned that day. Respect the water. Respect the way it moves, the way it waits for a chance to remind you just how fragile you really are. And if I see someone struggling, even a little, I don't hesitate. Because I know that sometimes all it takes is a few seconds for everything to change. I was freshly married in my early 20s, living in a small town in the mountains of Virginia with my husband Jake. We had just bought a little house at the edge of town, surrounded by trees and old logging roads that wound through the dense forest. It was the kind of place where you could feel like you were living 100 years ago. No cell service, nights so dark you could see every star, and neighbors who were more like distant acquaintances. Jake worked the night shift at a factory about 20 minutes away, so I spent a lot of nights alone. It didn't bother me much at first. Our house was cozy, and I'd gotten used to the sounds of the forest. The owls, the rustling of leaves, the occasional bark of a fox. But there was one night that changed all of that. It was a Friday about 10 p.m., and I was sitting on the couch reading a book when I heard a knock at the door. I froze, immediately feeling uneasy. Nobody just dropped by out here, not at this hour. And Jake wasn't due back until at least 2 a.m. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. A neighbor, maybe? But the nearest house was nearly a mile down the road. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I got up slowly, peeking through the curtain beside the door. Outside, under the porch light, I saw a man standing there. He looked to be in his 40s, wearing a dirty jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. I couldn't see his eyes clearly, but I could tell he was looking right at the door, like he was waiting for me to make a move. Something about him felt wrong. Maybe it was the way he was standing a little too still, or the fact that he didn't call out or say anything, just stood there staring. I took a step back, tried to keep my breathing steady. Then, like he could somehow sense my movement, he knocked again, 3 hard raps that echoed through the quiet house. I forced myself to speak, my voice barely more than a croak. "Who's there?" There was a pause, and then he spoke, his voice low and rough. "I need help. My car broke down up the road. Can I come in and use your phone?" I knew immediately that he was lying. There was no way a car could break down without me hearing it on our gravel driveway, and even if it had, he'd have passed a couple of houses before ours. And why hadn't he gone to one of them? Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to open the door, not to let him know I was alone. I tried to keep my voice steady as I called back through the door. "I can call someone for you. Just tell me the number." Another pause, and then he laughed, a short, humorless sound that made my skin crawl. "You don't need to be scared. I just need to use your phone." I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I backed away from the door, my hand fumbling for my cell phone, even though I knew I didn't have service out here. But as I moved, I heard the knob rattle, like he was testing the lock. My heart leapt into my throat. I grabbed the shotgun we kept by the front closet. Jake had taught me how to use it, just in case, and pointed it at the door, even though I hoped I wouldn't need it. "I've got a gun!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "And the police are on their way." For a moment, there was silence. Then he spoke again, but this time his voice was different, colder, angry. "You shouldn't lie, you know. It's not nice." I heard him step back, and through the peephole, I saw him retreating into the shadows beyond the porch light. But he didn't leave. He just stood there, staring up at the house, as if waiting for me to change my mind. I could barely breathe, trying to keep the gun steady in my hands, praying that he would just go away. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, but it felt like an eternity. Eventually, he turned and disappeared into the trees. But I didn't relax, not even for a second. I knew he could still be out there, watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. I stayed by the door with the gun until I heard Jake's truck rumbling up the driveway hours later. When he walked in, I practically collapsed into his arms, babbling out the whole story. Jake went out with a flashlight and checked the yard, but he didn't find any trace of the man. No footprints, no sign of a car on the road. He called the local sheriff, but they couldn't do much beyond promise to keep an eye out. They said it was probably just some drifter passing through, maybe a little too drunk or desperate. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just some random encounter. It felt like he had been waiting for that moment, like he'd known exactly when Jake would be gone, exactly when I'd be alone. I couldn't get his voice out of my head, the way it shifted from that false friendliness to something darker, like he'd been disappointed I hadn't fallen for his trick. For weeks after that, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound, the creak of the floorboards, the whisper of the wind through the trees, made my heart jump into my throat. I kept the shotgun by the bed and checked the locks on every window twice before going to sleep. And whenever Jake worked nights, I'd sit in the living room with all the lights off, staring out into the darkness beyond the porch, half expecting to see that shadowy figure standing there again. Months later, we heard from a neighbor that a man fitting the description had been arrested in the next county over. He'd broken into a woman's house, attacked her, and nearly got away before the police caught him. She'd been lucky, they said, managed to grab her own gun and hold him off until the cops arrived. When they showed his mugshot on the local news, I felt my blood turn to ice. It was him, same dirty jacket, same cap pulled low over his eyes. Jake held me that night while I cried, both of us knowing how close I'd come to being his target. And even though he's long gone, locked up in some state prison, I still can't shake the feeling that he's out there, waiting just beyond the edge of the light. We moved a few years later, closer to town, where the neighbors are nearer and the streets are brighter. But every so often, I still wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing for no reason, and I have to get up and check all the doors just to make sure they're locked. And every time I hear a knock at the door after dark, my mind goes right back to that night. The sound of his voice, the rattle of the doorknob, and that cold, sinking feeling in my gut telling me that if I hadn't listened to my instincts, I might not be here to tell this story. It's been years, but I still remember that night as if it happened yesterday. I was driving home from a late shift at work, around midnight, and the roads were almost empty. It was one of those winter nights when the air is so cold that the frost seems to glitter under the streetlights, and there's a thin layer of snow on the road. I was tired but looking forward to getting home, cranking up the heat, and sinking into bed. I was about halfway home on this long stretch of road surrounded by fields when I noticed headlights behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then I realized the car wasn't just following me, it was getting closer. Like too close. They were practically on my bumper, their high beams lighting up my entire car. I figured it was just someone in a hurry, so I moved over to let them pass, but instead of passing, they slowed down and matched my speed. That's when the adrenaline kicked in. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that maybe they were just messing around or didn't realize how close they were. But then they sped up and swerved in front of me, forcing me to hit the brakes. My car skidded on the icy road, and for a second, I thought I was going to end up in the ditch. I managed to regain control, but my heart was pounding in my chest. I took a deep breath and tried to speed up to put some distance between us. But the car followed me, speeding up again and getting so close that I could barely see their headlights in my rearview mirror. It felt like a nightmare, like something out of a horror movie. I had no idea what they wanted, and there was no one else around, no nearby gas stations or stores where I could pull over for help. My mind was racing, thinking of every possibility. Was it just some idiot messing around, or was I in real danger? I made a split-second decision to take the next turn off, a narrow road that led through a more remote part of town. I figured if I could lose them in the maze of back roads, I'd be able to double back and find my way home. But when I turned, they followed me, their cars skidding a little as they took the corner too fast. I realized then that this wasn't a coincidence. They were after me, and I had no idea why. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I felt this overwhelming sense of panic. I pressed down on the gas pedal as hard as I could, speeding down that icy road, the tires slipping on the snow. But every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, those headlights were still right behind me, like they were glued to my bumper. I started thinking about what would happen if I lost control, if my car slid into a ditch and I was stranded out there in the dark with whoever was behind me. I felt completely alone, like I was in the middle of nowhere and there was no one to help me. I tried calling 911, but my hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped my phone. I finally managed to get through and blurted out my location, telling them that a car was chasing me, that I didn't know what to do. The dispatcher's voice was calm, reassuring, telling me to stay on the line and keep driving until they could get an officer to my area. I could hear my own voice shaking as I kept glancing in the mirror, the headlights still right there, unrelenting. I felt like I was barely keeping it together, like I was holding my breath and waiting for the moment when they'd finally run me off the road. Then, just when I thought I couldn't hold out any longer, I saw the flash of red and blue lights up ahead. A patrol car was parked at the intersection, blocking the road, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The car behind me immediately slammed on their brakes and did a U-turn, speeding back in the direction they'd come from. I pulled over near the patrol car, my whole body trembling, and watched the taillights disappear into the darkness. The officer came over to my window, asking if I was okay, but I could barely speak. I just nodded, feeling the adrenaline crash at me all at once. I explained what had happened, but by the time they sent another unit after the car, it was long gone. They never found out who it was or why they'd been following me that night. For weeks after, I couldn't drive home without feeling that same panic creeping up, without checking my mirrors constantly, convinced that I'd see those headlights again. Even now, I still get a chill when I think about how close it came, how different things might have turned out if I hadn't made that call, if the patrol car hadn't been there just in time. I'll never know what their intentions were, but that feeling of being hunted, of being completely vulnerable out there in the cold, stays with me. It's a reminder that sometimes the scariest situations are the ones that come out of nowhere, when you least expect them, and leave you wondering just how much worse things could have been. Okay, confession time. For the past 6 months, I've been secretly learning how to bake. Yeah, that might not sound like much, but you've got to understand, up until recently, I was the kind of guy who could burn water. My idea of cooking was heating up a frozen pizza, or if I was feeling fancy, ordering takeout from a different place than usual. My partner, on the other hand, is a full-on culinary wizard. She can whip up a 3-course meal like it's no big deal, even making those tricky desserts that involve things like tempering chocolate or whisking to stiff peaks. I've always been amazed at how she does it. So, about 6 months ago, I was watching her make a lemon meringue pie. She was so focused, humming to herself as she folded in the egg whites. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool if, just once, I could surprise her with something homemade? Not just like boxed brownies, something that would actually impress her. That's when I got the idea. I secretly signed up for a beginner's baking class. I told her I'd picked up a new hobby. She thinks I've been taking up evening walks, trying to get more fresh air or whatever. But what I've really been doing is spending 2 hours every Thursday evening with a bunch of retirees and a very patient instructor named Clara, learning how not to ruin basic recipes. At first, it was a disaster. There were nights where I came home covered in flour, desperately hoping she wouldn't notice that I smelled like sugar and yeast. I failed at just about everything. My first batch of bread looked like a deflated football, and my chocolate chip cookies were more like chocolate chip pancakes, flat as a board. But I kept at it, watching YouTube videos late at night after she'd gone to bed, taking notes like I was back in high school. There were times I almost gave up, especially after the banana bread incident. It came out of the oven looking like something you'd find in a compost bin. Then about a month ago, something clicked. I managed to bake a loaf of sourdough that actually looked like the photos in the cookbook. I brought it to class, and Clara gave me this little nod of approval, like, "You're getting there, kid." I felt like I just won an Olympic medal or something. After that, I got braver, trying out things that I knew she liked, macarons, tiramisu. Even this complicated chocolate cake, she's always wanted to try making herself, but never had the time for. I've been stashing all my failed attempts in the freezer or bringing them to work, handing them out to my co-workers with a sheepish smile. "Here, try not to break a tooth on this." I joke, slipping them the extra hard biscotti or whatever monstrosity I'd managed to produce that week. My colleagues are starting to think I've lost my mind, but I think they secretly appreciate the free sweets, even if some are borderline inedible. Anyway, the big plan is this. I'm going to make her a surprise birthday cake. It's next week, and I've been working on a test version every night when she's out with her friends or doing her yoga class. It's going to be this rich, decadent chocolate cake with layers of raspberry filling, her absolute favorite. I even bought this fancy cake stand, and I've practiced making those pretty little rosettes with the icing, so it'll look like something out of a bakery. I know there's a pretty good chance I'll mess it up, like maybe the whole thing will collapse, or I'll mix up the sugar with the salt again. That was an embarrassing lesson I won't forget anytime soon. But I just keep picturing her face when she walks into the kitchen and sees this cake that I made just for her. No store-bought shortcuts, no mix from a box. Just something I put my whole heart into. I've never really done something like this before. And yeah, part of me is terrified that she'll laugh, or that she'll see through my disguise and realize I've been lying about all those walks I've been taking. But I think it'll be worth it, just to see her smile when she realizes that this time, I was the one who put in all the effort. Wish me luck. I'm about to attempt the final practice round tonight. And let's just say the fire extinguisher is ready and waiting.